I can just keep it. The meeting when I came down. Okay.
Waiting for a few more people.
There's no.
I just like your voice. Maybe just. I'm gonna do quick, so. I wanna do one more shout out to Maddie because she, organized every single meal. Every time she asks me for advice, I say, I don't want me to do making these decisions. They're risky. Great deal of uncertainty. So anyway, thank you, Maddie. Really grateful, really good. I also wanted to do a quick, shout out to our grad students who you may not know, who are not on Teams, but are, taking notes. And, Courtney Allen, Desiree Saleh, and Samir student.
August Weinstein.
So I thought Courtney could just say a few words about who you are, what your research is and why.
Yeah, thanks everyone for being so kind and welcoming to me this week as well. I'm a PhD student in the sociology department. I work with Sarah Curran. We have a really interesting project on population age structured change and reforestation in low-and-middle countries. And my dissertation focuses on a different topic on hospital segregation in the 60s and its effect on mortality outcomes. So if either of those things interest you, I'd love to connect, but it's been a really great week, so thank you.
Courtney used to work at DHS, so those of you who ever worked with DHS data, she's there. She's done it, and she was working with them until recently, so
Yeah.
still working on projects with them. Desiree.
Hi everyone, my name is Desiree. I'm a third year here in the sociology department. Kind of in between, not necessarily a PhD candidate, I'm a master's student, super fun. My research mostly has to do with health disparities. My dissertation will focus on border town communities and how the relationships between medical care and patients basically is different than in other areas. And then I also focus on like sterilization research for people of color especially, and how it's still prevalent and affects life expectancy and fertility of many women.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks for taking notes, and I know ideas flow fast and furiously, and so it's a very challenging task. I'll let August introduce himself later. Okay, so next group, let's do demographers. Excuse me. Not demographers.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Should I stand right here? I have to.
Yeah, it's a little short, I know.
Yeah, it is short.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome back from lunch. We are the Demographier Group, thanks to Claim to Flame. Also having the best name. We have the second best name, but they are responsible for both of the best names, so it's also quite nice. We decided an order for presentation at lunch, so this is probably gonna be a little rocky. I'm not sure exactly when we transition, so I'm just gonna keep moving through. Go to slide 5.
I'm on.
No.
Okay. Okay, so this is what we are interested in. We're really interested in the demographic characteristics of people who are living in high wildfire risk areas and whether or not they actually have the same demographic characteristics of those who are not in wildfire prone areas. It's very simple, very straightforward. And we're gonna do this with the FEMA National Risk Index data, which contains wildfire risk information amongst other things, and ACS demographic variables. So this is the wildfire risk index data from FEMA. We're focused here on the very high plus relatively high groups. So these two categories right here, as you can see, most are over in the west, though Florida, Central Florida, South Florida also has a high risk of wildfire. There's 60 million people in the US currently live in a high or a moderate high risk category. So one of these top two categories of population. So it's a lot of people who live in highly exposed, risky wildfire areas. We did have a debate about what variables we would use. We had maybe a lively debate. Yeah, I'll just leave it as a lively debate around this. I believe these are AI generated, right? No, they weren't. We tried to AI generate them and they didn't come out very good. So one idea was like theory driven, like what variables would we expect to see that might be different between wildfire prone areas and non-wildfire prone areas or other areas in the US. And then one that was data driven. I said, why don't we just download all of the data and then test all of the variables? Which, as you can imagine, that's what was causing some of the rift. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, you could just code it up, right? Just make it run. So we ended up going with a theory-driven approach for what variables we selected, also in the interest of time.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's worth noting that we might also continue and do the data-driven approach as well. So this is based on the theory-driven approach. And here's the conceptual foundation. Thank you, Samir, my advisor, for introducing me to this concept and that. Maybe many of you have seen this before. Maybe it's new to some of the folks in this group. But this is basically the conceptual theory, one of the leading conceptual theories of vulnerability. So it's kind of the intersection between these three circles. So exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So we can think about it in this wildfire case, somebody living in an area with a wildfire might be exposed to it. Their sensitivity to that wildfire would depend on, are they somebody who's living with a disability? Are they somebody living, who has, older, somebody who's older? So different people are sensitive to that exposure, and then the adaptive capacity might be, is it somebody who is able to access filtration in their home to filter out wildfire smoke, or are there adaptive steps that people can take at the community level? For example, going to a neighbor's house who has air filtration. We are focusing just on this exposure section. We're literally just looking at the demographic characteristics of counties and different units of measurement of people who are exposed to wildfires. And then in terms of the variables that we selected, they were based on the literature that looks at, yes, exposure, but there's also a lot of literature that looks at sensitivity and adaptive capacity. So that's where a lot of the variables that we selected are coming from this literature that, groups living at, for example, the nexus of urban and wildland areas, which is a new term to me that Sunshine introduced me to, that probably a lot of folks here are familiar with very well. that's a group that we were looking at, but we couldn't access that in the census data.
The next slide would be helpful.
Yes, the next slide is helpful. That's fine. Thank you. So here are some of the variables that we selected, based on the census data, the variables that we were able to access through the census data. But as, I just noted, there were some key theory-driven variables that we were not able to access in the census data, like the wildland urban interface. But yeah, so a lot of, I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room who know a lot more about this than me in the wildfire context of how these variables interact with people's vulnerability to wildfire. But, this is kind of what we pulled, and it's what we ran with. And we ran with it at the county level. Yeah. Am I doing this one, or
I can do this one.
go for it?
Oh,
Yeah.
so this is what high risk areas had compared to lower risk areas. They tended to have a higher SOBI score. They tended to be more Hispanic. They tended to have higher mobility, higher unemployment. They were more renter occupied and more rent burdened in those wildfire areas. They also had more construction workers, so more outdoor workers, which is very risky if you think about it. But they also had higher household income and higher home values. So some of the variables where they're higher sociodemographic variables might make them be more vulnerable, but others might be less. But they also had lower poverty. They had a lower percentage of their population that was Black. They had less disability, so they had lower rates of disability. But they had, and then weirdly, they had lower extractive workers, where people working in ag, forestry, mining, and so on. And they also had lower no internet. So they had higher internet. Because it's a double negative. I know. We went back and forth. Technically, it's no internet is the variable, but it's a lower no internet, which means it's a higher internet. Yeah. So some of these are a little surprising and what we didn't expect. These are the only ones that came out as being significant because we're looking at counties like everything is significant. Well, not quite everything. Like we looked at percentage female, for instance, there was no significant differences there. But we did run into a bit of a problem when we were thinking about this. And that's the level of aggregation. So that analysis was done at the county level. And if you look here, right in the center on the left at the county level, you can see Lander County, Nevada, which is considered to be relatively moderate risk. But Lander County has 2 census tracts in it, and both of those are very high risk census tracts, which is a little weird. That they'd only, and in fact, it's even worse with Eureka County, which is only 1 census tract. And its single census tract is considered very high, but the county is actually considered relatively moderate risk. So this is really kind of weird, because some in and out group now for the same populations are going to be defined when you compare. So like the same populations in Lander are actually in the low wildfire risk category, but their tracts are all in the high risk category if we did a tract level analysis, which we did. In which case, census tracts then that are high risk tend to be more Hispanic. They tend to have more under 18, more 65 plus. They have more veterans. They have more disability population, which was the opposite of the county level. They have more extractive employment, more construction workers, same household income and home value. But weirdly, the tracts have lower social vulnerability. They have lower percentage Black. They have lower immobility, lower unemployment, lower women. And they're also lower renter occupied and rent burdened than at the county level. They also had lower amounts of people that were less than high school. So this is like very odd if you kind of think about it. Many of these are going the other ways. So here's the exact same census variables just pulled for the exact same database for wildfire risk, just one is county level and one is census tract, which really makes you think about what is vulnerability using these physical characteristics as well, gets a little murky. Yeah, maybe we can take a question.
No, I'll hold it.
We also have a big table because you have to have these sometimes, which just shows the T-scores between them and then the differences between the high and the low for counties and tracts. And then we have a little flag on the difference, whether it's significantly different between the two, one is significant, one is not, or if there's a change in direction. So some of these like percentage 65 plus is actually a change in significance where it's significant at the tract, but not at the county, and a difference in direction, which is also like really weird to wrap your mind around.
Oh, it's my turn?
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that we're asking is what's lying under the surface, and what's happening when we're using, this level of aggregation. So the idea being, whether we're finding these patterns of fact patterns being reversed at the county level. I think this is based on those rankings that Matt explained and this level of, discordance between what we're finding between the counties and the census tracts. But the other one is the classic problem that you find when you're dealing with aggregate level data and different levels of analysis, is that maybe we're just facing a modifiable error unit problem where we are just simply the level of aggregation is going to influence the conclusions we do, and we have to be very careful at how we're describing these groups and the populations. And I'm sure there's experts in the room that could talk and do this topic more justice, but for the purposes of time, I won't talk more about it. But like as part of these, we had the amazing opportunity of being exposed to people who are in doing machine learning and AI. And I think for me, one of the things that I've learned from a colleague, I'm in the Department of Human Development, is that he was teaching a class of machine learning 2 years ago, and he told me that he didn't teach it for 2 years. And then when he came back to teach it, he had to revise his whole syllabus because like all the things he had taught 2 years ago were already like outdated. The functions were deprecated, and it was like a very interesting conversation to have. But so we had the opportunity of meeting people who will have their hands on this on a daily basis. And so what we now did is reverse a little bit on the almost a disaster of the voting we were gonna have, and like about like theory-driven versus data-driven. There was gonna be a vote, there was gonna be international observers. And I think the issue is that we had the opportunity to like ask, what method could we use to analyze this data? And Jason joined us yesterday and mentioned the PCA as a way to like look at this and pull by cluster analysis. And thankfully, he just said, give me the data, I'll run it. So run the principal components analysis, identify the number of components that, Jason, are you here?
Yeah.
Yes.
What is this 90% means?
So this is with the data that was there, this is, you know, the goal is we want to reduce the dimensionality of the features and ideally into a space that we can visualize, so like either into 2 or 3 dimensions. But in this case, if we perform PCA on the data, we need 14 components in order to explain that 90% of the variance in the data. And so if we wanted to just say like, oh, we just want to look at the top 2 components here, it's not actually enough to capture the variance and capture the actual structure in the data. So PCA is not actually, you know, a linear method is not actually appropriate for this data specifically.
All right. So then we got the latent clusters from autoencoder, and this is what we find. As you can see, there's 2 clouds or like clusters of very high risk counties.
Yeah,
Right, and what this is telling us is that there are similarities in the input features between the very high and the moderate high-risk counties, which is very consistent what we found in the descriptive profile we were developing, and we had developed, and which we used to compare counties. We didn't do this with the census tract data,
We didn't
right?
do this with the tracks.
Too much. And now Sunshine.
Yeah, so we obviously have some new steps that we need to do. We need to add in more variables in this framework. I'm sure all of you were like, oh, wait, did we add that? Whoops. And so we would like to go back and re-add or make sure we account for the percentage of the population of both Asian and Native American. We absolutely need to consider the measures of population density and also the population without citizenship. And we also have to consider data integration from other sources, as we mentioned before, specifically the wildland-urban interface. Not exactly sure, I know that I have to explore that data better to quite understand how the fire risk accounts for it versus how other data would account for it. So I can't just willy-nilly go out there and go, oh, this is great. So I want to make sure I understand that data. Also, there were several things that are indicators for adaptive capacity, which we don't have a lot of information for in American Community Survey, more specifically media access, because not having no internet is not the best identifier of media access. or English. And also the criminal justice system interaction is highly important for this activity. So that would definitely be another way that we need to go out and get a completely different data set to interact, have a better idea of the adaptive capacity, ability of those who are in this population. And also there could be other social vulnerability indices that we'll come across or be able to understand. I actually think just getting these three is already a really big ask, so I wasn't really excited about making that list much longer today. But I would appreciate if anyone had any other suggestions of data that could go in the future. The most interesting that happened was actually when Jason was running, we found when there should not have been, there was missing data. And there should not be any missing data because we had all the counties and counties are missing, right? Unfortunately, we discovered the Census API for 2022 didn't have any counties.
In
In
Connecticut.
Connecticut only, they had regional areas instead.
Yeah.
So if we ran it for a different 5-year ACS, it would be better, but, no, not that one. So that's a little problematic and also makes me think maybe we should look at some double checking quality data.
Yeah, so when we were pulling counties, we got Connecticut planning regions as classified as a county.
Oh.
But they're not counties,
Yeah.
they're planning regions.
And what happened is that Connecticut has revised the way they're measuring counties and like the ACS products are not gonna be updated until 2028. So like, that's
Oh,
when
you looked it up?
Connecticut, I dealt with this in another thing. I said it on Slack. And so. It's there. So there's a reason for this, but like, just for now, if you're doing pulls from the API, just know that the county level, Connecticut may not bring you any information.
We also want to double check the FEMA National Wildlife Index issues because it still make a little bit less sense that a county and an exact same census has different identities. And so our key takeaways, level of aggregation really matters. What is vulnerability depends upon aggregation. And also other takeaways is to look beyond the p-values. The number of census tracts influences conclusions. And also that whole data-driven versus theory-driven approaches, it didn't die very quickly. We killed it, but it was a.
All right, thank.
And then we just have one last thing we want to say, I'm so sorry, is that we are actually we decided to make sure that this work continues. We decided we'll put in an extended abstract for PA coming up. Oh, yes, I forgot also, we have thank yous and those were some of the reflections we had about the prompts that were given for D4. I'm so excited to be here and see everyone. We're really excited about the ideas of high risk and population growth. And we have ideas to study the future, to study the future of these events.
Yeah.
And especially because my dissertation is on this topic. I thought.
Great, thank you. All right, we have a few minutes for questions. Yes. Yes, Jess, and then, Mary Angelica, Samir, Vivian.
I just have a question about the associations that you found and the sign flipping and stuff. And of course, the modifiable area unit problem is probably always at play, but it doesn't explain, as you said, those cases where the area is still the same. And so I was thinking about the other side of the regression equation when we're dealing with counties and we're dealing with tracts. And I'm wondering how much of that might, if there's a way to portion out or kind of dig into what is on your outcome side that you may or may not be able to fix, but on the right-hand side, if you're doing ACS 2022 data, right, that has data at the tract level going back to 2017 in it. And so if what's happening with one of those variables inside a tract over 5 years isn't a slow trend, like if it's a trend one way or the other, then we would expect like attenuation of the effect. But if it's bouncing around over those 5 years, you might actually be plugging in very different values of the covariate for the tract than the county. So just something to look at as y'all are trying to unwind that knot.
Okay, thank you. I do, just a comment, I guess. And I lost track of who I said what to, but Mary Angelica.
Yeah, so just before my question to clarify, you use principal component analysis with the demographic
Yeah,
Yeah.
So that's what the SOBI, that's what they use, so.
Yeah,
and
that's
it's
what I-
a variable, so you're
Yeah.
just kind of recreating that, but just to like add on to that is there's already a dearth of literature of social vulnerability and like kind of the mishaps that are happening with principal component analysis with SOBI and these other
Mhm.
SPIs. And so I guess like what, like mine is also more of a comment, is like this theory versus data-driven debate is like, I feel like the data-driven debate is already getting critiqued to high hell for like,
Mhm.
like not a better term, so it's, I think some of the theory approaches might be more applicable and better in this type of space and maybe focusing on like those specific counties or that populations that you have, because I feel like if you were to like put this in a paper and send it to review and I was your reviewer, I'd tear you like, I would tear it apart, from like the data-driven side, just
Yeah.
because we know like the problems with how it doesn't align with theory. But if you want to talk more about that, I'm kind of an SBI.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm with Mary Angelica, like totally don't wanna talk about this.
yeah, we
So, I mean,
we spent a long time, talking about this and
You
disagreeing.
should have just asked me, I would have said theory.
No, it's like, I mean, yeah, we could rehash the debate now if we wanted to, I guess, but,
but having it in the same model with this.
oh, including Sobi in there. Oh, we could just take Sobi out.
Yeah.
That's easy. That's easy. We could just drop it. I mean, that's not a problem.
Exactly.
So we don't even, I mean, Sobi just comes from the wildfire risk index anyways, already has it in there. So it's like, this is really easy to grab.
Yeah, I'm just thinking if you're
Oh.
using kind of the same set of variables.
Yeah, there's a lot of
same
overlap.
methodology, someone will just read that and be like, you're just doing this SOBI.
Yeah.
Well, this isn't
Yeah.
PCA.
Yeah,
This one's not PCA.
Yeah, I think
PCA is the cluster.
I think we kept Sovian because we wanted to see, like, we wanted just the Sovi,
Oh, I see,
just to
I
look
see.
at
So
it
I
and
thought
just.
you
Yeah.
said PCA.
No.
Yeah,
No.
yeah.
No.
Okay, that's what I asked.
No, the data driven is what variables do we include? Because, I mean, why don't we have grandparents living with children in here?
Yeah,
Or literally any other variable that's in the census? Cause we could probably make a theoretical justification for why it might lead or not lead to vulnerability in a given area.
yeah,
So why not just pull them all?
yeah, and that's kind of what the original SOBI was, is they.
Pull them all,
The contingency, yeah.
but we're not doing a PCI on this though.
Okay, so Samir, and then Fabian, and then Lilia, and then Catherine.
I just have two things, so one
And
is
Ann.
this, it's hard to tell if, Julie and I are just quickly discussing, it's hard to tell if SOBI and all of those variables are in the same model or if they're different models. Because it probably wouldn't make sense to put SOBI and all of that into the same model.
These are not regressions.
They're not regressions.
These are just.
This is a t-test difference,
T-test.
yeah,
Oh, okay, okay.
It's a.
yeah,
We did a non-parametric test.
Okay, we got it.
Yeah.
yeah.
My other comment was, there's an interesting paper from some, I don't know their first name, last name is Spielman. Stephen Spielman.
Seth?
Yes, yes. Yeah. S, let's call it, let's call it S. We're getting big signal too. That
Thank goodness he wasn't in my.
That I'm gonna make sure that but they show something similar, that there's a lot of internal inconsistencies with SOBI. And I think they use California as a case study showing, if you just look at all counties within the US and then counties within California, how you almost get reverse signals.
Oh,
This was
something.
that paper.
All right, cool.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll dive into
Thank
it.
you.
Thanks.
Ready. Lily, I can't remember, Lilia? Yeah, yeah, Lydia. And then Fabio.
I just wanted to, I don't think I got it, what are you comparing it to?
Yeah, so these are,
County or populations to-
so this is the distribution of values with high fire risk areas and lower fire risk areas. So this is just a non-parametric means
in
test.
where?
So,
In the US.
yeah, in the US, so this is,
But wouldn't then you be
so this would be
comparing-
these two counties put together, these two categories put together compared to the others, whether or not they have actually
Aren't you
differences.
then comparing, like, aren't you just then giving the characteristics of, like Southern California, let's say California and Southern California compared to the rest of the US, like.
Which is why you're black, it's gonna easily show up and
No,
tutored.
no, because it's not just here, there's 104 units.
in like, the same counties, with numbers here, making the same, or maybe related similar or something like that. Maybe I can see how you're comparing what is related to fire and what is not.
Yeah,
But
so I
I
think,
think you're kind of giving a description of what is.
right, and I think Catherine wants to jump on that. Was that what you're? No, okay.
do that.
Okay.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense, what Leah's saying?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we're claiming that it's just exposure. We're like claiming that it's the differences in demographics between those who are exposed and not exposed. And yeah, of course, there's a geographic, there's a lot of geography in there. But I don't think, we're not making a causal claim at all. So it's just who's exposed and who's not.
I think the comparison, is it a fair, like, are we comparing apples and oranges, or are we comparing?
I mean, it's not just Western, I mean, there's
It's not just
King
Western
County,
US.
there's King County.
But we said Hispanic population.
It's lower.
Yeah.
Hispanic in county was lower,
Yeah, that's what, I just want to make a comment.
right? Hispanic is higher in counties and it's higher in tracts.
But it's also higher just in California or higher in Southern California.
And southern Florida too, yeah,
Yes, than in where there's no.
wildfire, right,
Yeah.
right. That's like exactly though,
It's in describing describing the population that's exposed. So
Yeah.
we would include, it's important what
Yeah.
population is exposed, even if it is population. I mean, I think that much is legitimate, that even if it is the population state, or the.
But then maybe you can do descriptive spacing, but not like a t-test compared to the,
Yeah, well, yeah,
That's
different.
a good question.
So he's asking like,
Yeah.
in California, is it true that most places are the most risk?
Oh, I don't know,
That's the question.
I guess we could dive in and look at that. We have the data for it,
Okay,
we have all the data.
Fabian, can you hold
So
for a second,
Connecticut.
because I want Ty,
Yeah,
this is.
mine's just a comment.
Comment.
You guys aren't wildfire experts, are you?
We are not,
Yeah,
are
so
you?
this is
Okay, sunshine.
Oh,
Could this
sunshine
be
is,
a- Could this be a symptom of theory-driven approaches when you're not inherently connected to theory?
So so I know I've been considering this deeply, and that's one of the reasons when I was thinking about how to link other data sources, how it needs to happen. And I have been in conference a lot with the idea and the literatures, but I'm having the reality, which is I'm great that we're here because Ethan's gonna hook me up hopefully. Because I haven't been able to actually have in-person conversations with people who are using the type of fire that is used in FEMA data. I've had plenty of conversations with people who are using different types of modeling, but not that particular type of modeling. So that's one of the reasons that I definitely have to dive deeper into that. And one of the reasons I don't have a longer list of things to think about integrating data.
Yes, Anne wants to make a comment.
Yeah, so just a quick comment, the National Risk Index, so another group that I'm part of is the Cascadia Coastlines and People's Hazards Research Hub, Cascadia Coast Hub. And it has a monthly seminar series, all the videos are online. And we had a very, very lively session on the National Risk Index. And we're planning on doing another one this year because it is fatally flawed, basically.
Well,
And because of these application level
Yeah.
problems.
right.
yeah,
So it's a really interesting topic, timely, because FEMA is trying to improve what they're doing. And definitely worth thinking about the sort of the theory part of what it means to be at the wildland or regulated interface. And by the way, I just this week saw another presentation on Florida. And there are a lot of fires in Florida,
Yeah.
and it's basically Floridians setting Florida on fires.
Looking at sort of.
it's a natural, it's a natural pastime of ours, we just wanna light the swamps on fire.
The difference between Landfire's approach and Epson's approach and the Missoula, that is what the conversation, and that's one of the reasons, so I am aware of that, and I have, but for this particular, week, we're just gonna throw that in and just pretend those are the three small things are, to think about later.
Maybe and then Catherine, yeah.
So I get the medical area of zero crime, I don't get the difference between county and I don't get the difference between the county and the track on the wildfire index, as long as and how you can get from relatively safe area at one level to very dangerous area at another one. And that tells me either they have a different methodology and then it's kind of problematic in our system, or they use a rank score. And then you have big clustering somewhere on the underlying
Yeah.
value and then just like shift to
Yeah.
somewhere along your distribution, like your percentage score. But it just makes no sense.
Yeah, I agree.
Good, good,
Yeah.
good.
I agree.
Good observation.
Yeah, this, when we snapped this, but it was like, wow, geez, this is really bad.
Well, yes, Catherine has a question, and then we'll go to Courtney, and that'll be our last, because I've eaten into the break time, so, yeah.
I
Catherine.
really appreciate this lively conversation, which is consistent with a theory of mine, that was like, eat, they're energized. One of the things that's coming to my mind as I'm thinking about all of these potential issues that you're confronting in this, is on the theory side, thinking about it from an inequality perspective. And that may be a way of reflecting on the variables where you're seeing these distinctions. Because if I understand the literature in these geographies, there is in fact quite a bit of inequality where you would have this high income, right? Like these non-vulnerable populations coexisting in the same geography as more vulnerable populations. So I wonder conceptually, that's a way of thinking about this particular problem, is the actual divergent intersection of the human population within these vulnerable hazard spaces.
Absolutely. And if you look at the history of the literature, it starts out with that and just kind of just kicks it to the side. And I'm like, that's interesting, but also by kicking it to the side, are you really examining, they are higher rated homeowners, so that doesn't necessarily mean that they're that less the risk again, that goes to how Sylvie might not be super helpful. And so that is also part of the reason that we have to think deeply about what to include and not to include and how to address the data.
Absolutely. So thinking about the demographic profile as opposed to a list of compositional features, the inherent contrast between those demographics.
Exactly.
Yeah, good. Courtney.
I just put it in the chat.
Oh,
It's a comment from YouTube Live.
we had a comment.
Sam's house. Sam.
Sam. Hi,
So. Yes.
Yeah.
Social capital and economic inequality, may have been, it's interestingly used because we're discussing exactly how you can measure, so that where the SOBI conversation comes in and how
Well,
able we are to address vulnerabilities. And also just understanding what are those vulnerabilities and how do they affect? And so understanding the population is key to ground this information and before we move forward in identifying what we can do for preparing for this or averting this disaster.
Okay, fantastic.
Thank you. Thanks.
Data discovery debates. See, cute. Okay, I don't remember who's next. How did I forget? I'm sorry, I put my t-shirt upstairs. Sorry.
In it,
Yeah,
campus
regularly,
so.
I think it's early. I think you should take a picture. Oh, yeah.
There, do you see it? Do you have a, you know, with your. It should be in there. Can you hold it down?
Get them all, let's get their screen.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah, we'll definitely coordinate. Can we do like a,
Yes, we
a
can do,
picture?
and do a photo. You guys wanna like actually come over? Or- Should I turn like this way?
Wait.
Okay.
There we go. Hi.
Okay. Ready.
I suppose that if anybody needs an acronym or a title for their NIH NSF proposal, contact Joan.
I will note I cannot really do acronyms, but
catchy titles, David and I can hopefully, yeah, we may have a consulting role. Okay, hi, we are Claims to Flame. And we're excited to talk about a little bit of what we did. Let's go to the next slide. We're UW and Columbia University, and we're all public health folks, except Karen, who's joined. So we're excited. All right, so these were our goals that we came in with. As you may have intuited, we're working with FEMA claims. So we're describing FEMA claims related to wildfire in California. We just honed in on 2010 to 2019 for this week. And then we had a couple questions about disparities in FEMA claims. So the FEMA claims are at the individual level, but they're also tagged with the zip code that people are in. So we had two different kinds of questions. Looking among similarly exposed places, we wanted to see the individual and ZICTA level characteristics of the people that were actually making claims. And then we were also interested in the individual and area level characteristics of claims that were actually successful and the percent of the claim requested that was paid out. We didn't get to all of this this week, but we'll tell you a little bit about some of the stuff we did. So these are the data sets that we worked with this week. We'll probably pull in some additional ones going forward, but census data, population data, Cal Enviroscreen, which is an EJ screen in California. We wanted to look at civic engagement, so we looked at eligible voters that were registered. And then we had previously put together a wildfire disaster data set that you'll hear a little bit about, and then the FEMA claims.
So to answer some of our questions that we're looking at, area level characteristics, we mostly focused on census and ACS data. You can see most of the characteristics that we're looking at up there, mostly socio-demographic indicators, income, employment, education. Housing tenure was an important one, looking at renters versus owners. And then race, ethnicity, we're looking at language, internet access, and then finally thinking about migration, not necessarily as a predictor, but maybe as a response to wildfires or, frequent wildfires in an area. And then we're also looking at rural population, using some census information from that, but also looking at an alternative measurement, population density per square kilometer. And then don't ask us how we're going to incorporate uncertainty in any of these. We haven't thought about that yet, but it's really good. Yeah.
Okay, this is Cal Enviroscreen. We put it up here, but I'll just go to the map. So it's just for people who aren't familiar, it's another aggregate index. It's trying to get at disadvantaged communities, both by environmental exposures and population characteristics. And this is actually used to allocate policy dollars in California. So we thought it might be important here. It's not inherently at the ZICTA level, so we had to work on aggregating it. But this is to give you a sense. We'll probably look at a binary, yes, no disadvantaged. We're disadvantaged are those in the top quartile because that's how policy dollars are allocated. And so that's what the California government deems important. So we were looking at overall and then also at just the environmental pollution burden. We're kind of interested in layering wildfires on top of places that already have kind of toxic exposures or other things going on there.
So can you go back just, so the white means that there's no, what does that mean? There's nobody living there.
This is why ZICTAs aren't complete.
Okay.
Because they don't cover all the space that exists. Yeah, so it's definitely a limitation of the FEMA claims.
Especially these people don't live there. Because there's no postal delivery there.
Exactly.
Or it's only business.
That
makes sense.
Yeah. So I'm satisfied now, sorry. And this is the distribution of people who are eligible to register to vote that actually registered in 2010 in California. So we have a gradient here, so it could be interesting to look at going forward.
Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna tell you a little bit about our wildfire data set so we've been working on
compiling a data set of all wildfire disasters in, actually the whole US, but for the purposes of this presentation in California from 2000 to 2019. And this, in our hack week, we decided to just focus on the time period of 2010 to 2019. This map here shows all the wildfire disasters that happened in California during this time period, where the color is indicating what year that they happened in. You can see that there are more wildfire disasters in later years. There isn't an agreed upon definition of what a wildfire disaster is in the literature. So in the process of developing this data set, we developed this definition where we included a wildfire in the data set if it had one or more civilian fatalities, it destroyed one or more structures, or it resulted in a FEMA declaration in the affected community, which is different than a FEMA claim or claim by individuals. It's at the community level. I think, yeah. So then we also identified ZICTAs exposed to these wildfire disasters. Eventually, we want to try to identify more specifically, like the number of people within a ZICTA that were exposed to these wildfire disasters. But again, for just the couple of days we had to work on this, we restricted ourselves to identifying ZICTAs that were exposed, whole ZICTAs that were exposed. We considered a ZICTA exposed if one of the wildfire disaster boundaries intersected with the boundary of the ZICTA. And this map shows the exposure of all the ZICTAs in California, with our most exposed ZICTAs having 14, being exposed to 14 wildfire disasters, and then of course there were some ZICTAs that were not exposed.
So now we want to talk a little bit about FEMA claims. We're not going to provide an extensive summary of what they are, but rather first we're going to look for these 15 minutes that we do have. So claims, just to be clear, can only be made for FEMA declared disasters. If, let's say, there was a wildfire and it wasn't declared a disaster by FEMA, then unfortunately people affected by that particular fire would not be able to apply. Next, FEMA claims require, at the bare minimum, awareness that FEMA support actually exists, knowledge on how to actually apply and complete the application. So if you have knowledge or prior experience about navigating administrative systems and processes, that's something that would allow you to apply for a claim. And last but definitely not least, the capacity to even document losses and damages, or what could be truly the worst day of your life. So these are some of the bare minimum requirements of what it takes to even apply for a claim. And so then that led us to question, what exactly are the characteristics of these FEMA applicants? And so you can't see the title right now, but right here on the left, we have residence type by year. And these are wildfire disasters. We see that a lot of applicants are homeowners or living in homes or are living in apartments. It's also interesting to note that in this dark blue, those are mobile homes. So it's not a small amount relative to the total. And if we could go on to the next slide when you have time.
I think, yeah,
Perfect, thank you. Cool. Thank you, guys. Okay, great. And then here on the right, we have gross income. I want to also preface that these are kind of preliminary analyses and we would dig into it a little bit more. And I want to note that the green bars in kind of below the yellow actually represent the highest income groups at a minimum of making $120,000 per year for a household. And it's interesting to note how small they are relative to all other responses. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. And then if we go to the next slide, we also have applicant characteristics by renters versus owners. That's something that we were interested in and something that's come up in prior types of presentations earlier today. And we see, interestingly, that the breakdown isn't overwhelmingly one or the other by year, but if we click the next one, we also can see spatially where exactly that might occur. So not only do we want to look at the temporal distribution of owners versus renters, but we would be interested in also assessing the spatial distribution, because the percent of owners per ZICTA does indeed vary throughout the state.
So another group of characteristics we looked at was program eligibility. So these are the housing assistance program on that side, and this is the individual household program on this side. And so you can see just a really simple like 0 or 1 eligible or not eligible. And so when you submit an application, we check to make sure that like it lined up that people who are eligible were the ones who are receiving, right, were having successful claims fulfilled, and vice versa. And so this gives you a sense just of like among those people who applied, who was eligible and who was not. And so then we moved into trying to come up with a preliminary metric of claim success and claim fulfillment and how much of requested or evaluated damage was granted. So this map is the percent of successful wildfire claims during the study period of 2010 to 2019. And so you can see that in some areas there is a 100% success rate among all the claims for a given disaster, and in other areas it can be quite a bit lower. You can go to the next thing. And so we wanted to get into a little bit more like how much money was assessed in terms of damage and how much money was actually granted at the individual claim level. And so in order to calculate what you see on this bar, and this must be your right, if you could advance one more time. Summed up these top two in the numerator, so the amount of money that is being given to people in the individual households program and the housing assistance program, and put it over the FEMA assessed damage to their property. And so that fraction is in this plot all the way on the right, which is the percent of FEMA assessed damage that was actually funded at the individual claim level. And so these are two like very preliminary estimates and metrics that we want to use in these analyses that we were exploring as part of our meet this week.
Nice. Thank you. Oh, keep going. We have a tiny bit more. We'll be quick. Sorry. Okay, so super quick, we looked at just some preliminary individual level predictors of the claim being approved. So these are everyone applied, as you just saw. Most people actually don't get the money that they're requesting. And so we can see younger people are more likely to have their claim approved. And this is controlling for renter status with a fixed effect for the disaster, because as we've been talking about, very different characteristics of people depending on the place. So next slide. Renters, much more likely to have their claims paid out versus owners. Next. Individuals with lower household income, more likely to have claims paid out. So this is good to see, I think. And then Karen.
Just very quickly, so we also aggregate the data from individual to zip level. Basically, each zip code, we are calculating like how many claims were successful in that data. And we see that most of the data actually have no successful claim at all, like 69%. And from level 2 to 4, we just like classify the level of success in terms of the percentile. And we find a result kind of, for example, like these two might not be very clear, but unemployment, for the most successful group of data, they actually have slightly higher unemployment compared to other two groups here. And interestingly, like in terms of civil engagement, on the right side, the voter register for those who are most successful actually also have more people registered. And in terms of like immigrants and linguistic isolation, we also find like non-citizen and not speaking English well population are lower in a successful group. But in the past 3 slides, we all see the interesting pattern that on the right side and the left side, these two groups actually have similar pattern, but the most successful and the most unsuccessful group actually have very similar pattern. And it's not clear yet whether the pattern is influenced by the level of exposure to fire or the level of barrier to claim
the FEMA. So,
Yeah.
this is something we are anxious to take a further look into.
Interesting. And that just relates to, we won't read through these, we'll leave them up, but I think that relates to the point of we need to assign the exposure better, because even though we have Zicta level data, we have the actual wildfire boundaries. So we can actually look and check, you know, at a 30-meter resolution, a very small resolution, which portion of the Zicta was exposed and how many people were truly exposed to the fire. So we can do better, and I think that will help with that too, so. Thanks.
Yeah. Question, Julie.
I have a question to clarify. What constitutes a successful claim? Is it whether people got what they asked for, what they applied for, or any funds, or how's that defined?
In the analysis that I presented on the individual level, it was just, did they get some of any amount of money that they requested versus none? Yeah, so that's like another question, like the proportion of the claim, yeah.
You could answer that.
I have a follow-up to that, which is, how long does it take to, once you make a claim, I mean, very,
Good question, yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I think it can be quite fast in some circumstances, like,
Okay.
I think the only information we have about this right now is just like, do you guys know the answer to this definitively?
Time from claim to resolution.
Yeah, so I've like been reading about some people's experiences on the internet, and some people say that they got the claim approved like a day after the disaster or 2 days after the disaster. I haven't read about anyone like, getting approved further along, but I think that was just like the people I was reading about.
Okay.
It also varies, like, there's certain, you can claim like, you know, that your apartment is uninhabitable and so you lost all the food you had and you get food assistance. And like, that's very different than claiming like, my house burned down in a wildfire and I feel like assistance with rebuilding my house. Yeah, which requires like, you have to submit to your insurance company and like learn how much they're gonna reimburse you, and then, so I think it varies.
I see, yeah, for what type of claim. Okay, sorry, I tried to, Sarah and
Yeah.
just because it's Sarah.
Providing a couple of resources on FEMA aid, especially because some of your results are a little bit contradictory from my understanding of it. So there's like the book by Sophia Middle Class by Max Besbris and Ann Rhodes, which talks a lot about how long and drawn out this process is, even to file the claim, but then also the actual disbursement of that aid. And generally, most FEMA aid does go to homeowners, because most of that money is for home repairs and rebuilding. Then there also is additional work by Ethan Raker, who talks a lot about the systematic and structural racism embedded in that process. He actually has a really detailed, like, front half of the paper that talks about how that process is. Highly recommend both of
This
those.
tornado paper.
Tornadoes, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, he had another that was just on aid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
There's like two sets of one there. The one that's just on like the FEMA recovery aid. One is like just about the process, and he has to submit the paper as well, but
Will you put it on the Slack?
yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna add some references since Sarah's offering
Yeah.
them. I already put them on the Slack, but there's one from Puerto Rico, Deepak Lamba Nieves and Raul Bartolome, or Santiago Bartolome, both published an analysis of FEMA data after Hurricane Maria that is in housing policy debate. So good a model of this. Also, Jack, Catherine and I and a postdoc, Katie McConnell, worked on a wildfire and migration paper that came out in Nature Communications last month. And so that's also another, I think it's interesting to read that because most of it is driven by the damage to housing structures. And that data on wildfire housing structure damage comes from a publicly available data set that we referenced that I also put on Slack that is, it's an interesting example for this group because they use the National Command Incident data set they digitize it and then mined it to collect all of the data on the wildfire burn print, the number of structures damaged, any fatalities. And I'm not sure if that's also a good source of data for other types of disasters, but it may well be, and it's just a great example of how you could use the kind of machine learning or AI tools to scrape data from federal records to create a really usable, comprehensive data set on hazards and disasters.
Thanks, okay, Sunshine.
So I had a question and a comment, and my first question is, I know you're aware of the variation in land governance in California is significant. And that would really have a big problem with your ZICTA, but I noticed that other than Mojave, a lot of those non-people areas overlap significantly with reservations and federally recognized sovereign countries. So I'm wondering how you account for that in your data, because they can use FEMA. I don't know if they interact with FEMA, but yeah.
We haven't done anything yet. Our plan is to get finer resolution FEMA data because the ZICTA is really not satisfying and they have it, I mean, they have it at the address level. And so we've been talking to them for about a year about it and we're kind of circling around to an agreement. So hopefully we will have full coverage.
Well,
but I agree that, I mean, certain populations may not be interacting with this program. So it would be, we will see that though, when we look at like the racial composition of places. We can also overlay with, indigenous territories in California.
And I just think it's just, I think it's super important given the reason they're there. And then the other question I have is about your timing. I know that you went, because, I feel like from 2017 forward, we've had more extreme wildfires, however you define it, and that's not exactly easily definable. We've definitely had an increase in loss of life, lots of loss of property, and also a different kind of population that's being affected. So was there a reason, is that why you stopped that time? Or were you thinking that it was just like, is that why did you purposely ignore it? I mean, not ignore it, but leave that out because it's sort of changing.
Oh, just because we have one day to do the data analysis. We're looking from 2000 to present in the actual analysis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I wonder how you will do with that big change, the type of,
Yeah, it'll be important to look year to year for sure, or at least within like 5 years box at this, yeah.
Okay, Tyler, do you have something quick?
Just real quick, yeah, I would say that the US Department of Housing and Urban Development has a sidewalk to, track to ZICTA conversion.
I used it yesterday.
Okay. So then you're actually accounting for this stuff already, then when you aerial interpolate, you're already getting a better spatial view of what's likely happening there, because what you're doing is taking smaller subcategories of that data and then iterating over it.
Yes, except the FEMA data currently is only at the ZICTA.
Yes,
We
still
don't,
keep it at ZICTA, but your ZICTA now is even more representative
yes.
than it would have been otherwise.
Interesting. Okay, Jess. Okay.
Do you have information on what kind of claim? Like, you talked about the difference in what people are claiming for, and it seems like with some of these results along the income distribution, another thing that actually parsing that out might be interesting.
Yeah, did Miriam or Lauren speak that?
By kind of claims, do you mean like which programs they're applying to, or?
Yeah, for instance, like the difference in food assistance and the difference in household repair, right? Because that's gonna look very different between renters and owners.
Yes, we have information on that. Feel free to jump in.
Yeah.
We focus only on things related to housing for similar reasons to the year situation of like having one thing. But, we have information on all of them and have explored it, and just shows to like try to have a manageable task. I am curious if you have like thoughts about how to think about some of those programs. There's like less documentation on some of them than others. So we spent a long time trying to understand the ins and outs of some of them. And we'll continue to spend a long time on it. But yeah, it is in the plans.
Okay, good. We have, before we break, what? Yes, thank you. Thank you. That's T-shirt award. First of all, I wanted to shout out to August. Maybe you could say hi and who you are, taking notes and what program you're in and.
Yeah, August or Gus, in SEPS, just down the road, student of Samir, is interested in like what information communities use to make adaptation plans and hazard mitigation plans. So why communities choose to use information like this, or what kind of stops them from doing so.
Yeah. Great. And where are you?
I'm just entering my second year master's program.
Great. Great.
Anne's on his committee.
And, okay. Anne, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I have just posted on Slack a survey. And we would, as you may have noted in the schedule, there's a 15-minute, we have a short break. Sarah will say more about that. And then you have a few minutes to fill out the survey. So please fill it out. We're providing time so that you will all fill it out. This is a stellar group and we would really love to have all of your input on the event.
I actually don't know what I'm to say next.
Oh.
Yeah, so you have until 3 to fill out the survey and take a break, so
Yes.
maybe you can organize your time between those two things.
Yeah, and so be back by 3. Okay, great. Take the survey, take a break.
And they'll post it on email too, but if anybody's not, like, for the question.
Like I have, you were like, you were in the group, I was just like, yeah, you guys have been great. I really like it. And I was like,
Yeah, climate is like, no one's gonna die.
It's always.
There's always not, there's never like anything.
When you get to eat.
What?
Now you get to
Eat? Yeah.
Then you're gonna die, that's why you gotta.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, there's also spotting these key things, like chronic. You know, people are concerned about it. Yeah. Yeah, like, people are concerned about it. But then, like, the ability to go, decades, Are you being responsible?
Yes, I do methods, but I don't really like her policies. So I do use like archival information. I'm always interested.
Yeah.
I think the PDF. Yeah, it's a PDF, but I'm trying to figure out how to.
And then they should be able to, like, once you share it, then it's full screen, you can.
Like, public things it is, including me, and like, what the field is, like, I did geography in undergrad, and I think that's really tough.
Yeah, that's true, actually.
Yeah.
That's a good.
Yeah.
Like that?
But.
Like that, and then they should be able to do.
Now.
Page up and page down.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I know that's a lot. I understand. Oh, demographics, like now, you know. It's okay, like, and it's like, oh, like I put my name and age on something, which is like.
Yeah.
I admit, but it's more that I got a population like that. It's relative, so they have to be raised by quality rates. Well, I think like you said, it's always.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's prevalent, like, Washington, and like, our program.
They have a sweet.
Like, they got.
Yeah.
And because of demography.
Is it separate?
Yeah. He's the one that did all this.
Not very. We're Stonefield, like half
You guys are doing a career guys tonight, so. I'm getting to. Yeah.
Yeah, it's changed a lot, but I like this, it's like. I think. It's like this reservoir, like something big, and then everyone loves going to feeling. Well.
Okay, great. Sorry, I sent you a yellow text.
Really? Yeah, everyone's always like, EW.
We have the DEMAS group, their acronym, very nice. Demography environmental migration in the United States, DEMAS. And delighted to have them and take it away. And their colleague, Jack DeWard, is on Zoom with us.
All right, thank you, everybody. So yes, we're DEMAS and we are we've actually been working together for a long time. And so we have made a lot of progress on assembling our data set that we call so our project is called Demography and Environment Migration Systems. And so when we're thinking about systems, we're thinking about what this is a population-centric perspective that focuses on the interconnectedness of places through the flows of migrants between those places. So you can imagine like, you know, I don't put up a fancy map, but Catherine has one. But it's, you can imagine like a King County and all of the other counties that it's connected to through outflows and inflows, who's going out, who's coming in. And that interconnectedness is not random, it forms a system. And so pressure in one part of the system may result in a change in the total system and then a response over time. So this is the data set that we're put together is a spatiotemporal data set that looks at county to county migration flows that we've created in the RDC, but it's inspired by a public data set called the IRS migration, county level migration flows data sets. And what it is a matrix of the flows between all 3,000 plus county and county equivalents from 2000 to 2020. So the population in this data set, this is why it's there are a number of ways in which it's an improvement over that IRS migration flows data set. One is that rather than being a representative of the tax filing population of the United States, it's representative of what we might call the social security population. That's how the Census Bureau refers to it. Everybody has a social security number. And so that means about 330 million records each year. And it is also, unlike the migration data from the IRS, it's decomposable by age, sex, race, ethnicity, and nativity, so that we can actually tell something about inequalities in the flows of migrants within that system. And that's one of the things that we are most excited about, because it allows us to really think about what happens in different places and how it affects different groups of people differently, whether they're different in age or race or nativity or sex. And the reason why we're working, we have all these individual level records, but we put them in this county framework because that's the level at which they can be really linkable to characteristics of environmental hazards and other place level characteristics that help us to get at the exposures that people in these places, the environmental hazard exposures, as well as any kind of characteristics of the place that might make those places more or less adapted to those hazards, which is a really important modification of the hazard exposure and its impact on people. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over now to Sarah.
So now we're at the point, since the data's been constructed, on how to best integrate environmental data to really get a lot of the questions we'd like to ask with it. And with that, since we have a county level analysis, we had to think through how we would like to aggregate our environmental measures to the county level, which largely exist as a raster. And so for here, considerations include how to both best meaningfully measure exposure to different forms of hazards like extreme temperatures, air pollution, wildfire smoke, hurricanes, drought, floods if we get better data. And then also make sure we're trying to capture heterogeneity within that region and affected populations. And a couple of different things we've discussed is considering spatial mean, so just kind of weighting everything within a county equally, using a population centroid for a point estimate, so where most people live, and if a hazard is there, then it counts for the whole county, or doing a population weighted spatial mean, which kind of offsets that overall spatial mean according to where people are living. And we decided to go with a combination of a population centroid for things that are more like disasters, like hurricanes, which best captures, a storm passing through, and then population weighted spatial means for things like temperature or air pollution, as people may be spread throughout the county. And it's really not as much of a point estimate, because it is a continuous kind of thread. And mapped here, we have one measure of wind speed, which we've used in other projects, and we'll be integrating with this data set as well, made by James Stone. As you can kind of see, wind can travel inland, and it's not just concentrated on the coastline. So that's the other thing with our measures, is making sure we're capturing the full extent of these environmental variables. Now I'll pass it over to Catherine.
I'm timing myself, but my timer won't time me. Okay, it's timing. So first, Sarah said that we could share this YouTube link with loved ones. So just a quick shout out to loved ones who actually are on right now. So this is the point in a normal talk where we would be presenting data. And while we don't have super slick t-shirts, we do have a great tagline, which is, we can't talk about it. Per what Beth introduced, which is these are restricted data and everything needs to be disclosed. Otherwise, I will be imprisoned and fined, and I will not be able to speak with my loved ones as easily. And so instead, what we're going to do is just stay high level and share with you what we can. This is the fancy map that Beth shared with you. And again, emphasizing that population-centric perspective. And I'll get there. But first, we're really excited about the spatial and temporal dimensionality of these data. You got a sense from what Beth introduced, the magnitude of the data that we're working with. And so it presents some real significant challenges for us, but also some really
fantastic opportunities to understand the spatial temporal dimensions of these migration systems, which are clearly dynamic. And so we are empirically setting out to understand these simultaneous dynamic elements of a migration system. With that in mind, one of our guiding principles is actually parsimony, something that has come up in our week together, in our time together this week. And the way that our team has been discussing what we do think is a priority of parsimony is in terms of interpretability. So actually wanting to present to our not only academic audiences, but to broader society, also the results. So this is a challenge that we are considering. And then also, and not unrelated, is the computational elements that are necessary to handle the magnitude of these data, and especially within the computing environment that we have the opportunity to take advantage of. So these are two elements that our team continues to reflect on, and we have some ideas moving forward. And we're not going to tell you about them. Another thing that has come up for us this week, and we really enjoyed reflecting on it, is thinking about some of the priorities and standards across maybe disciplines and also maybe across different agencies that disciplines are working with. And so here I think about a lot of, and this relates, I think, to the established and emerging tools, I think is what I would like to pitch this under. And so there are these standard, we're a team of demographers, and we are a team of demographers who have been brought up on formal demography, as well as some emerging tools in demography, and then the tools that are brought to us today that are not this week, that are not widespread in demography as a field. And so as we're reflecting on the balance of these different tools, some things have come to mind, including, again, priorities and standards within our discipline. And we've talked about them even today, open science being one of them. Pre-registering is something to keep in mind. Reproducibility is another guiding principle. So this is something that we've reflected on and have come up as we've discussed different analytical tools to tackle these really exciting data. And I think that what that has brought us to in our team's efforts this week is, again, even though we're a team of demographers who come from the sociological discipline, we very much individually and together come with a cross-disciplinary perspective. And so want to be very much aware of and cognizant of these different guiding principles and standards, given the nature of the content that we are pursuing here, which is the intersection of the environment and the human population. But I just wanted to point out that my fancy map comes from 1885. And it demonstrates a guiding principle about migration systems, which is where there's a flow, there's a counterflow, but more importantly, the interconnectedness of places. And so that is an essential element of our project that we're studying. And at this point, somehow, Jack is going to appear, at least vocally.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, so you can't see me. I thought you guys could all see me. Sorry, you guys. I was up all night with a sick kid, and considering it's the.
Hold on,
we're gonna make you. Yeah.
There we go. There you are.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, sorry I couldn't be there with you. I was up all night with a sick kid, and I couldn't do it. So let me kind of extend on the group and what they've said so far. So we have a couple of pieces that are milling around. So one is the use of the restricted access data in the RDC. That's a whole art. I would sometimes call it a frustrating art of learning to use those data. And so I hope that you'll ask us questions. You know, Beth has really taken the hero's lion's share of the work on leading all of that, of course. But that's a unique resource. Whether it's a resource that other people will be able to access is up to the census. But, you know, the census is a persuadable organization. So maybe folks in this room can talk about, you know, ways to persuade. We have an orientation around the interdependencies of places and really a place and place-to-place based approach to demography. You know, whether you want to tie that back to the work of folks like Andre Rogers in sort of human geography, Whether you want to, build in the Ravenstein connection, it's a particular way of looking at the world. And what I really enjoy about working with this group is that we're thinking about these sorts of place-based connections, how places are connected to one another. And the third is really the ability to dig into the data in ways that, the IRS data, even the consumer credit panel data, that you can't. So what we're also thinking about, though, is some other linkages, particularly to environmental justice, which I'll just call EJ for those who aren't familiar with that body of research, and then some other things. So in making this connection to environmental justice, I wanted to kind of draw your attention to three key pieces that our group is discussing. So we talk about spatial interconnections and spatial interdependencies, but underlying that are deeper sets of interconnections and interdependencies. So in the migration systems world, which goes back to the 1970s to Akin Mabugunje, who was looking at rural to urban migration in Africa. The spatial piece is really a manifestation of all these underlying moving parts, and that's the system. You can talk about it in terms of an engine, a set of dynamics. There's a lot in the literature on that, but I think that really thinking about these interdependencies. So if King County is connected in these certain ways to other counties in the United States, that's neat, but it also opens up a whole can of worms with respect to other important questions about those interdependencies. And it was really neat during one of our conversations this week with James, who's not on the call, but he's at NCAR. He's really been pushing us to think historically, both in terms of hurricane and extreme weather events, but also in terms of how we got to the point where we are, right? Because you can't understand the present moment without understanding the past. Second is the notion of differential and disaggregated. And so what I mean by this is that whether we're thinking about exposures, vulnerabilities, risks, adaptation, we're also thinking about and able to look at in our data different populations and subpopulations in places, right? There's a lot of work, and I used to be at the University of Minnesota with IPUMS, and our group also discussed whether it's IPUMS versus IPUMS. And if you pronounce it IPUMS, Steve Ruggles will find you and cut off your legs. But it's interesting, though, because there's a lot of push around disaggregation with respect to micro data, which is important, but not every question is a micro data question. Ron Lee has made an argument about this in the demography space, nicely articulated years and years ago. So focusing on these kind of the place-based approaches, as I mentioned before, and also thinking about disaggregation, I think is something that's really needed here. The third piece I want to emphasize, and somebody brought up the notion of intersectionality earlier, the first day, second day of the event, which I really appreciated, because when we think about intersectionality and, our data are disaggregated by, age, nativity, sex, and race, we're thinking in ways of which these things come together. And then we need a model of this, right? So, Patricia Hill Collins, who's a sociologist, had talked about the sort of matrix of domination, right? Which you're thinking about all these things coming together. And, a couple of years later, the feminist scholar, Myra Marks Ferry, built on that in a different way and coined this notion of interactive intersectionality, which is the idea, and I put this sort of node and edge diagram on the slide today, to imagine that we're talking about a set of places that are connected, but think about this like a trampoline, right? So if you're looking down on this trampoline, there's a bounce on the trampoline. So let's say we call that an extreme weather event. And the reverberations across are going to look very different, depending on the extreme weather event, space, time, populations. Intersectionality tells us that everything is connected to everything else, that's actually the wrong approach to try and, quote, tease something out. So we need to be looking at, in the case of our data, at these migration systems and networks from the vantage point of the intersections of age, sex, race, and nativity. The interactive part of this says that we have to think about these, as sort of incarnations, right? So even jumping at the same spot on the trampoline is going to look different at different points in time. So heterogeneity is really the name of the game. And so I mentioned this is a paper that we just published in the special issue of the International Migration Review. It's a group of, 20 co-authors and myself from around the world, led the first author, because we organized ourselves by first name, is Amina Maharjan. And this opens up the final point that I want to mention. We use this interactive intersectionality lens to talk about an organizational framework for conducting migration research. And so the final point that I want to leave you with is the what else piece. And We've said to you guys that, we're a group of social scientists and demographers, and the four of us in front of you today are not a very diverse group. And so the paper that I cited there before was the attempt of that group of 20 folks to recruit people from different sectors. So you have people from academia, from government, from NGOs. You have people from all parts of the globe. So making sure that the Global South was overrepresented, not underrepresented on the group of authors. And then people at different career stages, people who are in their second year of a new position at UNICEF, for example, and then very senior migration scholars. I can tell you, it was one of the most difficult papers I've ever written in my life, and I don't really want to do it again, but it was an important paper. And whether people agree that it is or not, it raises a challenge about the composition of our research teams. Another thing that we talked about a little bit at this conference too has been, we talked about vulnerable populations, and there's a literature that really pushes back on this notion of vulnerability, and that these people and these groups somehow need saving, somehow need intervention, as opposed to being left alone from processes that involve invasive capitalism or other things like that. So there's a whole bunch of questions here that are as much substantive as they are processual. And so I, really enjoy working with Sarah Beth and Catherine, and really enjoyed our just the chance to have these conversations, not just about what we're doing, but about how we are doing it, and increasingly trying to do that with more intention, more integrity, more inclusion. So I'll leave it there, and I'll turn it back over to Beth, who started the group.
Thank you. Bye.
Oh, okay. So I will wrap it up by saying, I'm sorry that we didn't have more data to show you, but yes, it is true. The tagline, "We can't show you," is true, because working in the FSRDC, this is a major job. It takes a long time to get through the whole data process there of applying for, submitting a proposal, having it accepted, learning how to work in that environment, doing the work, proving that to the Census Bureau in the final stage that the data outputs that you're requesting to take out do not disclose any personally identifying information. Then you can publish. And so it's a much more, there are several more steps in this type of work than there would be if you were using public data. So you have to go in really knowing what you want to get out of it, and having a pretty clear-headed idea of how you're going to get there in an efficient way. So having said that, we've been in there for years to put this data together. Yeah, but we're now at the point, the most exciting thing that happened for our team this week, from my point of view, is that we all went into the RDC at UW together, sat down, looked at the data, looked at the description of the first report that I've written, an internal report, and now we've sat down and we said, what are the spatiotemporal modeling approaches we're going to use? What are the big questions? What are we going to prioritize? We would, and I want to just tell you all, because of Jack's comments about, sort of data democracy. I would love for this data set that we've created to become publicly available. And there's actually no reason why it couldn't become publicly available under the same sort of restrictions that the IRS data is publicly available. But at this point, we don't see a path forward on that, because it's up to the Census Bureau. It's not up to us. But, we're going to get some of our work out there, and if it stimulates good questions from you all, and there's opportunities to collaborate and find out new things, it's there. It is a resource, but under these FSRDC conditions. So thank you. Any questions?
Questions? We have like 5 minutes. Yes, Kit, and then Fabian.
I just want to very lightly push back. I understand the data set requirements. I'm just curious about, you mentioned we have ideas, but we can't say them. What I just want to understand, what are the risks, what you see as the risks in sharing your ideas?
Oh,
There's no, it's not that we can't share our ideas. We can share our ideas. We just can't tell you anything that we've found yet. So the rule is anything that's only knowable from within the RDC cannot be discussed outside of the RDC until you've gone through the disclosure review.
So basic descriptions of what the spatial array, what the migration system would look like, that would inform next steps analytically, we can't share.
All right, thank you for
But
clarifying.
what I can share is that some of the things that came up for us this week, we're thinking about, and also thank you to the floaters. So Jason, our conversation with you and Patrick, our conversation with you are really helpful in constructing our thoughts around analytical possibilities moving forward. And then I think that Jerry talked to Jessica.
Yes.
Okay, and then Jessica, I'm really looking forward to with you. About efficient ways of conducting the spatiotemporal analysis. Because we have some of our older tools that we've relied on, which do come from a frequentist perspective. We have classic techniques of projection that are very standard for the demographer toolkit. And so intersecting those with an AI perspective, and then also intersecting those with a Bayesian approach is what our team is considering, is moving forward on those two paths. And I'll just share my bias right now is moving forward on the Bayesian path, which may cause Sarah to shriek into light.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
Maybe just a quick follow on, just because there's so many projects here that are thinking about migration but don't have the kind of data that you have. Could you say something about what will, how you're thinking about your migration measure or how you're thinking about a research question in this with these new data?
Well, I would point you to, Jack and Catherine and I have worked on the IRS data. And we have a whole series of papers that we've published that use that data and that pretty much describe our approach to thinking about this as a system, migration as a system, which is it's not just about in and out migration rates, although that's possible to do as well. But we really want to understand how the size of the flows of migrants into and out of, let's say, a focal region. So we have a demography paper where we looked at the focal region was the Hurricane Katrina affected parishes and counties. And then we compared them to the other Gulf Coast counties that were not affected. And we did regression analyses in which we showed our outcome variables were the magnitude of the flows and the number of counties that were tied by those flows, both in and out flows, so separately. And what we found was that the Hurricane Katrina migration system, the Hurricane Katrina affected regions migration system before the hurricane was largely predictive of what it would be after the hurricane, although what it did change, and the way it changed, it became more urban. It became more regionally concentrated. So that's what the more short distance movement. And it became more intensive. So the flow sizes increased for multiple years after Hurricane Katrina. And so that's what we've found already with that data. One of the things that really propelled us to do this is that we found out in another publication that in Population Research and Policy Review that the IRS county migration data has problems. After 2011, there was a change in the production process that is not transparent. And it introduced a lot of noise, particularly in the directionality data. So the net data, the net migration data isn't so bad. It's a little noisier than it was before. But if you look at the directional data, it's very noisy. And so we decided that it wasn't really usable anymore. And so and so that really pushed us to pursue other ways of constructing migration flow data from whether it's in the RDC with this data or with the CCP data, the Consumer Credit Panel data that the Federal Reserve has access to, or there are other data sets, all of which have their issues, but they all sort of, for this kind of data, administrative data is really valuable for having the spatial coverage that allows you to associate it with the geographic measures that we're all interested in using when we talk about hazards.
If I could just add on to that, and I'll thank you, Beth, for that. And all of those data sets give you the total. And yet we know from migration research that there are some pretty racialized migration patterns. And a lot of what drives our research questions are, they're focused on inequality. And so generating a data set that focuses on race-specific, nativity-specific migration flows over this really important period of time within the United States is also a significant motivator for us to invest our time in the RDC project.
And I just want to add one thing, that just to give credit to where credit is due, this way of thinking, looking through the data has incurred with many conversations with the one and only Matt Hauer. So Matt, thanks to his work, who is also a co-author on the PRPR paper, looking at the IRS data.
Okay, cool. Fabian had a question before you, Matt, but is this relevant to this? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's relevant to this.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
If one of the worries about releasing the data or bringing the data outside of the RDC environment is disclosure avoidance, have you guys considered approaching the Census Bureau to use their own differential privacy algorithms on your data to actually get it out, which would then qualify for following their own prescribed values for
The RDC data are already subject to disclosure avoidance to the algorithm.
They're already differentially
They
private?
are.
Actually, so.
Well, that makes
No.
no sense then.
No, not this.
No, not this.
Not social security.
Not social security.
Yeah. So
No,
the database,
okay,
yeah,
so
make it private.
we, that would be a good idea, except for the fact that the DRB has decided that they are not in the business of disclosing data sets, in spite of the fact that they did it for Raj Chetty. And so, but that was sort of like, he got out the gate before, and then they made the rule. So, so that's where we're at right now, but I think there's always room for negotiation.
Always positive.
So, Fabian,
I have a related question, and I come from a field that is basically changing the rules of political science about reproducibility. Especially South Journal now actually requires you to submit replication data with the manuscript. Given the data we've been working with, and it seems like if we want to get better migration data, we have to go through that process. How do you deal with journal reproducibility requirements? What is your experience there? I'm just curious about it.
Yeah, well, in my experience, journals often say, we want you to disclose all of the data that, to make it reproducible, or tell us why it can't be. And so, I think that we fall under that latter. That's what we'll have to say. But within the RDC, when we go through the disclosure review, we do turn over to them all of the code that we use to produce the analysis, which is different from producing the data set. But we describe the construction of the data set. So there is accountability along the way. But yeah, I think when you're dealing with PII, personally identifying information, it's often the case that you just simply can't comply with that mandate of reproducibility. It's just not public. Yeah.
And I think that it falls short a bit, but there's the technical documentation that we'll be going through. The details, how the data were constructed, and one of our desires is to make a publication that details what we did So that with the hope that when folks can access it through the RDC, they know what we're doing. And then we have a practice of when conducting analysis, that our code is available. So it falls short, but that's what is within our power that we're committed to.
Courtney, and then, yeah.
Yeah, there's a question online. Sam is asking, will any of the data available at the RDC allow you to draw conclusions about the pressures associated with migration, whether it's forced or not?
No. Okay, Sam, hi. I wish we had some respondent gathered data on reason for move. We have looked, I know Jack and I both have looked at all of the federal statistical data that collects reason for move that's reported by the respondent. And it's only available in the American Housing Survey. And Jack, what's the other one? Is it the CPS?
CPS,
Yeah, and so even when I've looked at that data about reason for move, the response options are pre-populated and this corresponds to everything we know about migration. Most of it is voluntary for reasons of, a change in housing due to family changes, life course changes, or moving for a job. What I did look at the AHS data, and I'm sorry, I have not published this yet. I really need to. But when the AHS included a value, a response value of because of a disaster from, I think it was from 1998 up until 2015 or 13. And they dropped that response because so few people actually checked that response, that they moved because of a disaster. It was in most years, it was less than 1%. The only exception to that was in 2005, when it went up to about 2%. And in my perspective, this was a really valuable question. I actually proposed to HUD that they reintroduce that question, and they have. They've reintroduced the response move because of a disaster, but there's some missing years in the data series.
Okay, we have to wrap because we have to get the last group in. So thank you, and because we also had this really nice conversation hosted by John Moe from NOAA. So I really want to be able to fit that in before dinner.
Yeah, sorry.
And we do want to acknowledge that Deborah is representing a larger group. I don't know how many people from,
Or no, I'm
she's
sorry.
had attrition.
Like,
Team attrition.
and then just select your presentation.
Oh.
And you can hit this little minimize, but.
So I'm here with where's the slideshow? Right there, so great. Okay, I know at least 2 and maybe 3 of our collaborators are here, unfortunately, so. Hi, we are really the disaster demographers, we had a name change during the event. And Dylan I know is online, as maybe Melanie is, maybe Lori is, and Jenna I know is. Helen had to leave early today. Dylan was supposed to come back today, but was unable to. And Melanie, many of you met, she was here before as well, and Lori's been remote with us some of the week. So we did the best we could, and though we represent 3 institutions, we back at our own institutions, this project actually has quite a bit of engagement with others in our home institutions as well. So so even though we're a mixed group of social scientists and environmental scientists, we have GIS specialists, we have sociologists, I'm a demographer, we have public health people. So we have a range of sort of physical and social scientists on our team, and we represent 3 different parts of the country. But I also want to say, I'm going to treat you to the New York speed of talking, since we're the last one.
Yeah, the New York Minute. And so, and then when we open it up, I'll invite, whoever of my colleagues are online to help answer questions. So hang on, Dylan and Jenna and Melanie, if you're there to answer questions. So I've integrated the prompts that we were asked to address into our presentation. What excited us most about the week? Well, honestly, working in person and dedicated to leaving our day jobs behind. You know, we come from 3 different parts of the country. And so really that was great for us and to be here and focused, but also interacting with like-minded researchers. You know, like I was talking to a couple students and they said, oh yeah, I'm like the only one in my department doing this. So really nice to be together. Our basic challenge was really our big data issue. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. We started on one supercomputer before we were set up to use it before coming, not the NCAR one, and we switched over to the NCAR one. So thank you. So the question we came to answer was, how has the burden of hazards on the US population changed in the past decade, and what implications does this have for risk mitigation and emergency preparedness efforts? So, and more specifically, who is disproportionately exposed to hazards? And it may seem like we know this question, and we've seen today, I would say until like the last couple presentations, a real focus on using aggregated data. And for those of you who, I'm just going to talk about microdata for a minute. I have throughout my career used all forms of data, aggregated data, gridded data, which are aggregated, transformed to a grid, microdata based on censuses, based on surveys. And I think it's a little helpful to understand what the power is of these different data types. So, and like we just saw example of data that are so restricted in because they have individual identifying information that they're in an enclave where you can't, you know, disclosure has to be, we have to protect the identification of the individual. So, and we have a different form of that in the data we're using. So, but the questions that have really asked about disproportionate exposures to hazards in the US have focused on either been very specific to specific hazards like coastal zones, sea level rise, at-risk areas, or smaller place specific, you know, after particular storms, Hurricane Katrina, Superstorm Sandy, and so on, or they rely on aggregated data, and including like the SOVI, which is very used frequently. These are all very dominated in these are aggregated silos of, and they represent the problem that they face is that they are susceptible to ecological fallacy and inference that you can make at the group level does not hold up at the individual level. And that is a really important issue to pay attention to. And that is why as social scientists, that is why a lot of the statistical infrastructure of the United States on the social science side is based on survey, household and individual level survey data. So some of what motivates this work today is not exclusively to use the American Community Survey, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but to use that as a basis for understanding, for going forward and using household level data that are panel data, meaning other big data sets, but that don't have the same, that are like such as the Health and Retirement Survey or the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth that are much sparser in their geographic representation. So this really helps leverage what we can understand from those. Also, and then lastly, the prior studies also tend to focus on disaster with those presidential declarations. We've heard a few people talk about some of the difficulties in using such data. So by using the data set that we're using, the SHIELDIS data, which we heard about a couple times, and we're going to hear a little bit more about now, we are able to overcome that because all disasters are in it. Probably not so good on heat, but okay. So, because heat doesn't typically cause the same kind of damages that are in the data set right. So, how have exposures changed over time? We will look at that, although it's a short window of time. And how do the hazards differ? How do the exposures differ by hazards? Spoiler alert, we did not get to that this week, but we will. Okay, so the features are it's national in scope and representativeness being a really important feature. The understanding of households and individual characteristics from the microdata records. So we ask who's at risk based on individuals and households, not these ecological units. Over time and place, is risk changing, for example, and which areas are at increasing risk and who in those areas are at risk, and not just like silos again, but like population by age and race, ethnicity, and household type and poverty status for each strata. You can continue to go.
Furthermore, understanding a continuum and compounding exposures, and identifying potential exposures requiring differentiated risk and understanding how they are compounded. So data sources, 30 million in records and in the individual and household public use microdata, PUMA. Is the acronym. We need an acronym list for the next hackathon, I think. It's a good one. So, in all interdisciplinary settings, we should have an acronym list from the American Community Service, ACS. So we've heard of, a lot of people have used ACS data. Some people were using ACS aggregates for tracts or counties. We're using the microdata. The microdata are available only at the PUMA level. What are the microdata? It is it's a 10% sample of the census, essentially. That's what it is. So it's administered differently, but that's essentially what it is. A little bit more on that in a minute. So it's not aggregated, but full information on individuals. And it avoids, again, that ecological fallacy. We couple that with county level disaster damage and fatality data from the spatial hazards, events, and losses data, SHIELDIS for the US. How do we do that data integration? So we came, having done our integration, we temporally link the data, and this is a little tricky. Some people may not like this. The exposure data in year T is linked to the population characteristics in T-1. There's a reason for this. The reason is that the ACS represents a year and SHIELDIS is monthly. So we cannot, if we attach those in the same year, we may very well be getting demographic behavior from some households that have occurred post-disaster. We want to avoid that. So we aggregate it to year, and then the exposure, and that's why we do it, a year before. The PUMA county integration. So this, in a trivial case, I'll show you pictures of this, the only maps we have. The ACS PUMA is fully nested within a county, not a problem. I'll show you why. Challenging cases when the PUMA spans across more than one county. This is state of Washington, where we are now. SHIELDIS is the county level. They're so gray shades. There's no thematic thing, just other than the different counties here. There are 3,215 counties in 2020. The ACS microdata at PUMA level is represented by those red boundaries, so you can see it often is the outline of a county's. In some instances here, no, you can't see that there. So around where we are now, right around the Puget Sound and everything, there are a lot of there's sub within county level PUMAs. So the PUMA represents 100,000 individuals, and therefore, and there are slightly less than 2,500 of those in the US. And the data are constrained. The PUMAs are actually constrained to states. So the first case, Spokane is a much simpler example. Spokane County, Spokane is like within Spokane County, there are two PUMAs, one representing different parts of basically Spokane City and Greater Spokane, and they nest fully within it. And in our database, we know the individuals, the SHIELDIS database for this case is this county. It will apply evenly to all individuals in this county, regardless of whether it happens here, where maybe not so many people live, here where a lot of people live, and here where even more people live. The size of the PUMA, the geographic area of the PUMA, the smaller the PUMA is, it's like more urban, probably. So in the middle, we see one PUMA, one county, and then the tricky one is the one over there where one PUMA is split across multiple counties, and there are none of those in the state of Washington. That one is showing from Pennsylvania. So one or more PUMA fully contained is like this example. We can treat these easily, as I said. So here's the tricky one. We linked the 1% ACS sample to, I think I said 10%. Did I say 10%? I did. Misspoke, 1%. 1% ACS to SHIELDIS data from, we were running little trial tests with 10% samples on it, just 10% of these just to get things running. Brain freeze, whatever. 1% sample of the ACS for these years, this roughly 10 years of data. The PUMA County Crosswalk, we use this tool called GeoCore at the Missouri State Data Center. I encourage you all to use it if you ever need such a thing. It's very helpful. The crosswalk is based on block group populations at the county PUMA intersection, and we can expand the year range, but we'll need other data tools to go back because it doesn't cover all these periods, and the conversion changes over time. So we did this probabilistic allocation of the ACS persons to counties. If the person is duplicated, if the home PUMA intersects two or more counties, then the person is assigned a weight based on the intersection, for example, 0.8 and 0.2 or half and half. And this allocation factor is then multiplied by the ACS weight. So that's how we do it. So it's a proportional allocation rule essentially based on these distributions. So, so we're not overcounting, we split people proportionally based on where we expect that they're going to be. So, and then this leads to roughly 10 million person county observations for each ACS year. Oops. Then moving on to this is, yeah, sorry, this is our work yesterday and whiteboard, sorry. It was easier than, these ones didn't have to be polished, right? So we didn't want to deal with the equation editor. So the SHELDAS records monthly and county level type of disaster. Many of you may know this, right? The amount of damage, the damage per population, the amount of crop loss and fatalities. And roughly 90% of the population lives in a county exposed to a hazard in any given year. Therefore, we apply the threshold. So that's a very high rate, right? Very high. So, of course, you know, with about 80%-ish, 80-some% of the US population is urban. So like if it's concentrated, it's like not like the craziest statistic, even though a lot of the disasters happen in rural areas, right? But it's more than 80%, but sorry, I'm just forgetting the exact number. So anyhow, we create a cumulative measure that incorporates loss of property, which is listed over there. So we add, it's a cumulative, we take the, we sum the crop and property damage plus the sum of the fatalities using a, and multiply that by the SVL, which is the statistical, the value of statistical life, sorry, that's flipped. It's so this is statistical value of life, but yeah, it's VSL, right? And then we divide that by the county population. And then we use a threshold based on the very next table. So here, so we've done this, this is the VSL statistic, it comes from here. And we use the median. There's a median VSL value. It's like in 3 bins, we take the median value of the statistical value of life. And that comes from a FEMA statistic. So here we are using FEMA, and up here, we're applying this one. This is the FEMA county, these are not, this is the beginning of our sample here, but they have a countywide indicator for which the loss declaration goes into effect. So we use that county level indicator. Now, of course, rather than state levels, because as we heard a couple times this week, state level, sometimes states can't meet the threshold because of the population denominators going into it, but often counties can. So our measure is cumulative, so it's easier, it's a more inclusive measure to get people into that category. So we do that, and again, then we apply it so that's how we calculate our exposure measure. We can talk more about that later. And we have, I'm not going to talk about the demographic variables, voila. Here are the ones we're using a bunch. These are they're both demographic and economic variables coming from the data. And because they're microdata, we know the characteristics of all these things per individual. So our analysis plan 3 objectives describe the distribution over time, the demographic trends in time over by damage and fatality, and is the exposure metric becoming more or less concentrated. Next, changing exposure by group over the study period, heterogeneity, unpacking that, looking at the patterns by different groups. And we start getting into visualization problems at that point. And then even worse, splitting it by hazard, which we haven't done yet, but we want to deconstruct that heterogeneity further. So I'm going to show you our preliminary results. They're based on all disasters together. They're not differentiated yet. Using the thresholds shown in the previous slide, the first 2 slides are just a single year, 2013 disaster, 2012 population. And then the following 2 slides, just to keep you on your toes, have the year at the bottom, but they're actually the year is 1 year prior to the disaster. Yes, yeah, exactly. So, but we didn't put the correct year should be 1 year later if you're thinking about this as who's exposed. So following the 2 slides over time, and then when you'll see that we really run into a visualization problem. So, okay, here's result 1. So this is looking at just age by race and ethnicity. We see that we have very prominently that non-whites, non-Hispanic whites, this is the pink line at the bottom, are flat and low. The y-axis here represents 42 to 52% exposure to and to a disaster at that threshold level. These are the sizes of the population groups that we have here. And by age, non-white whites, basically non-Hispanic whites are flat and low. There's no differentiation by age. All other groups do have differential age exposures, and importantly, this orange reddish line here, I don't know, yeah, reddish up there. That's the Hispanic population. They have particularly higher exposures at older adults and Hispanics and American Indian and Alaska Natives, the kind of bronze colored gold line, have much higher exposures than others. Of course, there's no point in doing statistical tests. We could, but everything would be statistically significant since we have a gigantic number of records, so we're not doing that. So, but at least these are meaningful differences, and that's what we're looking for. Okay, I can't get it to move down. Okay, there we go. Okay, now looking at poverty. So this is another cross question here. The poorest group is the red line at the above. So again, we're still focusing on age, and we're just showing single stratifications because 3 is just too much to show in a thing. And we're just starting the analysis. So we show that the poorest group again has the greatest exposure, and the least poor group, the blue line at the bottom, and these are represented as households relative to the poverty threshold. So the poorest group is the red line, bluest group is the least poor line, or maybe the wealthiest line. And just to be clear, again, the age distribution is not gigantic, except we do see we see more variation in some groups than others, but the difference between groups is quite important. Okay. This goes on and on, but now this is moving to the overtime, which people have not done heretofore. So we really were excited to get to this. This is one example. Now we are, so on the bottom, on the x-axis, you see the temporal change. And again, the exposure rates on the y-axis, and the exposure, this is by blue as foreign-born, and the gray line is by native born. And you first of all see year-to-year turbulence, which is something important, right? If there's not, the exposures are not the same over time. We see this in we'll see this dip in everything we look at probably, because that's just the nature of the disaster. But more importantly, the foreign-born are more likely to have greater exposure. And then looking at this is showing, so this gets to the complexity of the visualization. We see for every color, the deepest color is the population over age 85. The middle color is the population 65 to 84, and the lightest is 45 to 64, and we left out young age population in this in particular. And just looking at we don't see exactly the same patterns. Some are quite close together. For example, the blue and green lines, which are black and whites Americans, but we see the Hispanic line is most, it has its highest again. And we also see that among them, the oldest adults, the 85 plus, have greater exposures. So the non-Hispanic Asians have the oldest non-Hispanic Asians in 1 year do have a lower one. I would hazard to guess that maybe that is a small group. I'm not sure. We'd have to look at that. It is, again, remember, this is a population of, the oldest group is 85 plus. So in some populations, it could be quite small. These are rates. So we have not applied some measure of uncertainty around those rates, for example. Okay. So what insights from our work would facilitate the decision-making and tools? We hope microdata will provide a much greater nuance to who's at risk. They can help facilitate resiliency efforts, adaptation planning, and early warning. And they can do it in a way that's much more nuanced than the siloed data that are easier to use. Therefore, this effort is, an attempt to invest in figuring out how to use them in this context. Of what we learned this week, potential real-world outcomes, well, TBD on that. So what do we need to keep this work going? Well, we definitely need continued computing support. We hope we have engagement with others, particularly the groups that are, using similar data, which is most groups. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting things we can learn from you. And hopefully that, by discussion, we can both learn from one another. And also for groups that are really focused on particular hazards for understanding different kinds of hazard, interpretations. The visualization support, we haven't, like, you can see, like, if I wanted to show all age groups, all in that chart by race and ethnicity already for one, over time, gets really complicated, right? I showed only 3 age groups. So, if we added 4 more, it would be much harder to read. We were asked, what do we think the most promising prospects are for the work that we tackled? Well, we think that preliminary results are interesting. And we hope will open up the use of these, open up hazard research world to the uses of these microdata. Next steps, we're gonna complete the objective ones, work on objectives 1 and 2, the bivariate and the univariate analysis or 3-way analysis, but then working on, we have choices to make in objective 3, unconditional exposures, and then conditional exposures with covariates. We had I think as Dylan mentioned, we had this like nice internal debate within our team, whether we should go into a regression framework or not. We don't have a causal analysis. We don't want to abuse the use of descriptive regressions. We're not going to run t-tests or anything like that. So the only thing the regression is going to do is help us put all these variables in at the same time, but which is definitely like attractive because it's there's a lot of data. On the other hand, it may kick out some other things that are of policy relevance. Like even if something becomes statistically insignificant because it's highly covariate, there's a lot of correlation with another variable, it still may matter. Like some variables are modifiable and others aren't. So if, blacks are disproportionately poor, which they are, and you have both, blacks and poverty and in your regression and one and because they're so highly correlated, one falls out, then you may, the policy choice may seem like it's obvious, but it of course isn't. So we've had conversations about that. And then finally, lastly, we can attach the year after the disaster and start looking at some pre-post stuff, but that's still a further way away. And we're going to look at different thresholds to see how the thresholds themselves on the exposure side, like how sensitive our results are to how we specify the exposure and the multiple hazards. Longer term, we'll share the code when we get to that point. And we'll share it also so people who use Shieldus can go ahead and use this, and other people who want to use ACS can do this. And then we would like to begin to reflect and begin thinking about the policy implications for the many vulnerability indices, how they're used in policy settings. So since I'm the last one, I would have said this anyway, but I'll take the opportunity on behalf of all of our groups. A big thanks to our hosts and their tremendous efforts. You guys really did a great job in letting us, encouraging us to come prepared, facilitating the engagement, keeping us productive throughout. Like, congratulations, it was really amazing. Our team wants to give a special shout out to DJ. Thank you for the supercomputer help. That was amazing to watch, rapid speed problem solving. If all emergencies could have that kind of response, we wouldn't be here. Thanks to the floaters too, really great to have them around, and also to our funders for, bringing us together, being interested in moving forward these collective objectives. So thanks. And I'm done, and I'll find Dylan and Jenna and whoever else from the team is online for questions.
Stop sharing.
Yeah, yeah.
We go.
Great.
Hi, guys.
Hi. Staring at me.
We have a question from Ethan and one from Jason.
Phil, for the presentation. Thank you so much. This is really exciting and elegant design. Since you have access to a supercomputer, and if you want to get more leverage out of it, what I immediately started thinking about is your ACS PUMS Puma to county allocation. And it brought to mind an approach that we've got a lot of mileage out in some of my work, 2013 paper in demographic research by Matt Ruther, Stefan Blake, and Nicholas Nagel. They use an approach, maximum entropy, for imputation of the county associated with, well, I think in their case, actually tract associated with a PUMS record. Since you have a lot of information at the tract about who lives on either side of the county divide within a PUMA, you can use that information to probably make a more educated allocation or guess about which county that particular person in that record lives in. And I think that you could probably get even more confidence in the demographics at your county level by doing an approach like that.
Great, thanks, Seth.
Can you pop the reference into the Slack?
Sure.
Yeah, great. Jason?
Do you mind pulling back up the figure with the 85+?
Yeah, not a problem. Okay, Jenna and Dylan, you're gonna leave the, you'll still be here, but I'm not looking at you. Hold on.
Share.
I'm just going to the, no, I think that's, I shouldn't have to share. Do I have to share it to see it? Oh. Oh, here, hold on. Okay, hold on. I'm there, yeah. Okay, okay. 85+. You want this one? Yes?
Yeah, maybe it's a naive question, but maybe if you could help just clarify, is it fair to do a comparison, let's say, between like 2015, 2016? It's just the exposure rate, but it doesn't necessarily account for the population difference of that certain group. You know what I'm saying, like
No, these are rates. So these are rates. So the population, if the population is small or large, it's the share of the population exposed in this, right? The size of the group does not matter in this case.
The total population.
The age specific
Age specific
yeah.
population.
Jenna or Dylan, do you want to answer that?
In other words,
differently?
what's the denominator?
Or is
That's
it
the
like
question.
It's the total of the group, so it's the within group exposure. So
Right.
for 85+, it's the share of 85+-year-olds who are exposed in a given year.
Or Hispanic?
Yeah, for among Hispanics. So these are shares, relative, group specific shares.
Okay.
Good, thank you. I got that one right.
Does that resolve what was operating in the back of your head?
Yeah, and I assume it's a large enough. I saw the number, I stepped out momentarily, but there's enough.
No, the
data
numbers
to
here,
actually
yeah,
support
the numbers were for a different one on a previous slide, like with this one here had the numbers, but this was just by age, not by, this is just by race, not by, this is the total, yeah. Yeah.
Tyler and then, Beth and then
Just
Samir.
to build off, I think you have two approaches. From what I can tell, you're just using a traditional spatial proportional allocation for your population between those two pumas. So you could use a population weighted spatial allocation. So you could build in an understanding of what the different populations are in each county. And then take the spatial allocation, multiply by that population, have a better estimate of where you can produce. Or even more effective would be Daisy-metric mapping, like get Microsoft building data or whatever you want to do, your big residential system. Then you could just overlay that information. You'd have the number of residential houses on either side, and then you would be able to make that weight pretty easily to kind of allocate it more specifically.
Right, we
Yeah,
can.
I don't know how many this is, so this could be like. a
Right, so
very
just so you know, I would say we can do all these fancy, I mean, Dylan and I both have spent a lot of our career doing some of these kind of whatever, spatial allocation modeling for, and they're all good suggestions, but and I think some of the sensitivity analysis should sort of try to unpack whether we think the results we're getting are more descriptive and more robust in like places where we have the one-to-one puma or the one county to many pumas as opposed to the opposite. So this is this impacts rural areas disproportionately, I mean exclusively. So that is and it's not the only problem. The other problem is we don't know where, of course, this is true for all of them. We don't know where, the other problem we face is we don't know where the disaster exposure is in that area. So we would argue that the disasters can be disruptive, even if there's not loss to the community. Disasters can be, can affect the way people think about like choices, like whether they choose to live in a location or move from that location, whether they choose to live with, in multi-generational households to like, share, as a partly because there's an increasing trend in that, or maybe there's an increasing trend in that because there are, people are moving away from more resource, climate sensitive areas and so on. So we can do this, but we do have these two issues that we will look at urban and rural, we have some metropolitan county status to look at. And then we can ask whether we should probably spend the effort in doing a more careful reallocation. And I'm sure some reviewer is gonna tell us that. So,
Deborah, can I add to that?
absolutely.
Dylan has something to say.
So I really appreciate those two suggestions, and I missed the name of who asked the first one regarding the Ruther paper. But
That was
Ethan asked it, Dylan.
Appreciate that. So in my group at ASU, and this is kind of it'll be a little bit later on, we're building off the Ruther paper to do an allocation down to the census tracts. And so we're using the kind of iterative proportional fitting approach, which could give us a probabilistic allocation of the PUMA, the ACS individuals to the tracts, which could help us address one of the downscaling problems. The other downscaling problem, which I wish Melanie was here, she could say something about it, is actually downscaling the hazard exposure or the hazard itself. So I think we have a kind of a credible strategy for the top downscaling and to be more precise. But I think we don't have a plan yet of how to take these county level hazards, particularly in quite dense, population dense parts of the country, and scale those down to the census tract. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, that would be super appreciated as well.
And for some, yeah, especially hazards folks here, but we understand some of the hazards do have like tract level identification, but not all of them in this database, and they're not publicly available in there. That's not what they release. So that would be more experimental. And we're aware that both of these are like broad strokes. Let's call these broad strokes exposures, for example. And this is also a problem that other groups were talking about here. So yeah.
Downscaling, upscaling, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I really appreciate where you're going with this, and I think that decomposing it by hazard type and, figuring out a lot of specificity is gonna be really important for figuring out what's going on with these demographic patterns. But what I wanted to bring us all back to is some of the understanding of mechanisms by which hazard exposures connect to people. And this is something that I think we all need to, as well, the social scientists in particular really will gain a lot from focus and will contribute a lot by focusing on mechanisms that some types of hazards like hurricanes operate through damage to the built environment, or whereas others like drought operate through damage to crops and cattle and
livestock.
I'm many generations off the farm. And so we lose a lot of that specificity when we just simply look at these figures, but I feel like it'll help you to have a theoretical framing where you disentangle some of these causal connections, and particularly the focus on residential assets and livelihood assets. That those are really the things that are, fatalities are important. They're the direct effects of hazards, but in the US, they're really pretty small compared to the property damage and the livelihoods damage. And so focusing on the hazards that are most impactful through those mechanisms, I think will really be a great contribution to the field.
I'm gonna invite Samir to ask this question, then invite John to come up as Samir's asking this question and comment.
This is a little bit of a naive question, but just as you had race and ethnicity linked, are you able to link gender, age to those records?
Totally, yes.
Okay, so if that's the case, why not consider an intersectional approach? So similar along to kind of what Beth was stating around disaggregating or specifying. It would be interesting to look at how these different systems of oppression intersect to actually shape the exposure to a hazard.
Right, that's our goal. It's just, this is as far as we got. And in the, I mean, we have the records, they're all linked now, so we can, it's just a visualization issue. So if we wanted to show what we showed by age and this one by age and poverty, if we wanted to show this by gender as well, which we could do, we would have to show you two graphs, like the male graph and the female graph, for example. And so, yes, so, but that is the goal. Thank you. Yeah, to unpack this.
Okay, one more, I was just, maybe we can continue on, but I keep thinking about, early in my career, I started working on multi-level modeling, and I'm kind of struck by the lack of multi-level modeling discussed here, especially where we landed now conceptually and from our theory-driven approach. But it strikes me that that's another area where some social scientists could offer a lot with regards to mechanisms and thinking. I mean, we all sort of throw in that fixed effects or whatever, random effects modeling, because we know there's correlated error, but actually we know there was like a whole, like 2 decades of work around multi-level modeling. And I think we have now built data that allows us to actually take that, go there. And that would be very, very illuminating. So, okay, I am going to turn it over to Jonathan.
Cool.
Yeah. What? Oh, yeah, someone help Jonathan.
So I have no desire whatsoever to keep you here any longer than 4:45. So this will not be a nice conversation. In fact, a nice conversation to me would have a nice glass of wine or a drink in front of us. But I'd like to start a dialogue that it will continue, and I think plans are afoot to keep this activity going. So just wanted to pose some things. The closing one, happy closing.
Thank you.
Thank you. To pose some things to think about, to consider, and to feed back to us, because it's been nice for me being back amongst sociologists and demographers. My training is in sociology. I've left the field a long time ago. So, but it's been nice revisiting a land long ago.
We took classes from Phil Morgan, for those of you who are demographers, Phil Morgan and
Sam Preston, Susan Watkins. And I haven't thought about these people.
Then he went to Randall Collins.
And yeah.
Yeah.
And that's, and for those who know Randy, know why it's sort of. So, I thought it'd be kind of good to revisit Merton here a little bit. In fact, my longtime collaborator was a student of Merton at Columbia at a certain point. So the manifest functions obviously were to explore social data integration for studying weather hazards, to identify or explore new or core data sets, to explore AI and ML methods, and to explore this type of events. Are they useful? Now, the latent function here was really one of the reasons why we wanted to fund this was to gain some user experience insights, especially in a collaborative setting. So I'm with NOAA. We received funding, which is where the funding from this came from, or some of the funding, we're not the main funder. For the bipartisan.
You are the main funder.
I don't think we are, no.
Oh,
There's
I don't know. Well, we, NIH, but I don't think we did the same amount.
Okay. From the funding we got from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, you've heard probably Societal Data Insights Initiative. That's one of the things that I'm focused on. My colleague Kyle Back is focused on, and part of that is building a data platform for NOAA. Hopefully at some point maybe go public, but really to do the kind of analysis that you were all doing, but bring that now into NOAA and allow us to begin to do all the stuff that you're doing. So we really wanted to use this as an opportunity to do some of that user experience insights or research, what I like to call UX research, right? Never mind. Really interested to gather what did you learn this week. Now, not the sort of things like we already know, we generally know the challenges of data integration and using AI and ML. They're pretty well identified, pretty well known. This won't be the closing discussion because I'll just close these out there. And floaters, you're off the hook. I was going to call you out and have you talk. You have the best job of the week. As someone who's done participant observation research, I would love to just have, again, I tried to at the beginning, float around a little bit, just to see how you're all talking, your conversations, what are you learning? And I did pick up a lot of interesting things. So really what I want you to think about, either for your evaluations, if you haven't filled them out, but you know, as we move forward, maybe documenting some of these things. How did your projects change from early scoping, and more importantly, why? So you did a little bit of planning before you got here, right? And then reality hit. You talked to people, you learned some things. So how did they change, and really, what was the impetus for some of those changes? What did you learn that made you change those projects? What new noteworthy knowledge was gained by participating? It could be challenges, obstacles, methods, approaches, tools, etc. Whatever emerged from this collaborative atmosphere. And I'll give one example, and I hope I don't steal it. It's actually your team, Julie, where you said you were working on something and someone nearby came and said, oh, it's Sidekick Mobility Library. That kind of stuff, serendipitous learning, you know, and that really only happens in an atmosphere like this. So what are the kind of things that emerged that really sort of maybe showed a new insight, a new tool, whatever? And then, of course, in terms of continuing this conversation, what will you take away from Hack Week, either for your projects, if you continue them, hopefully you do, they're all super interesting, or for your research generally. So that's really the value of the Hack Week. So, you know, think about these things, either you put them in the evaluations, maybe if you want to send a side note to the organizers, they will make their way into a retrospective report. And I you know, again, we sort of know some of the larger challenges. It's these little serendipitous things I think are really interesting and useful to find out of what you gain from one another, right? So the sort of cross-functional diverse teams, which is a big part of my research in scientific settings. When I did research, I since left a long time ago. So that is it for me. I know you've got flights, you've got great Italian food coming up, so I don't want to get in the way of that, but I'll post these on the Slack and you can.
Okay, no, I think stay up here. I think we'd like to just have a little bit of a conversation.
Oh, okay.
So some of the funding for this came from the P2C Infrastructure Research Environment, which is funded by NICHD and the Population Dynamics Branch. We proposed this in our reapplication for that. We called them at the time D3 events, Demography, Data Science, Disparities. So we're gonna have several more of these over the life of our current grant. And so for that reason, we wanna hear from you about this, but also we also want to continue the conversation. So let me just put it out to Ann and I have talked about that and how we might do that too. So, and then we would love some like off the top of your head remarks before we break for dinner.
I'm always quick to get out of here.
We add one word.
Yeah.
So Julie and I, over many years, have interacted with NOAA and NOAA advisory groups, and Julie more than me, but it was very clear to us early on that social scientists didn't have much of an influence on what was coming out of NOAA, and that there was a huge potential for this. And what Jonathan and other people who work with him, Gina Esco in particular, have really done is they've taken up the calls that we've put in our various reports and things to pay attention to how NOAA could improve its services and fulfill its mission better if it incorporated social sciences in a really integral way. And so what we see this workshop doing is both meeting the methodological goals and the interesting challenges that Sarah outlined in the proposal for funding from NIH, and also fulfilling this call for making a federal agency that's really important in the environmental domain in particular do its work better. So we welcome all of your insights.
So, thank you, Ann. Great. The other through line here is that Deborah Balk and Lori and I and several others in the room have, I don't want to jinx it, but it looks like we're going to have some funding from NIA, to do some bridging around, trying to build more connections between the social scientists and climate scientists, and also build out tools and knowledge around not only the specifics of different kinds of data and how you put them together, but also these larger questions of uncertainty and visualization and data integration and et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So that probably will be coming out soon. Yep, we'll be hearing more about it. Lori and Deborah are leads on that project. So there will be follow-up. The very specific follow-up is that we would love to have a follow-up webinar Zoom thing with all of you to find out where you are on your projects. And that's one follow-up. And the other is that if you have ideas for integrative kinds of papers that we might put out for a commentary in science or PNAS or something like that, where we could talk about some of these big ideas, post it in Slack, and then we'll try to like organize, you know, you all see it, and we can organize these larger, big thematic projects. So one idea that Catherine and Jonathan and I whispered about at the back of the room in the first day was these frigging data walls, privacy data walls, proprietary data walls, and the larger issue around, you know, why they exist and how can we, and why it's so detrimental to understanding this critical issue of, you know, resiliency and climate, adaptation. So that's like one project, but I'm sure there are a gazillion other you know, integrative topics that we could have. Yes, Deborah.
You know, when I see this like collective of people talking about like different research projects and different approaches and everything, it strikes me that there's like a community level paper to be written on why, you know, why different approaches, you know, and different data integration tools, like similar but different, and different data choices, like how do you match the research question with the data? But like, everybody in this room came thinking they were doing the best they could for their project, right? It's not like they were like, okay, I'm gonna start thinking now whether, you know, like, oh gee, I didn't think at all about using, you know, data X, Y, and Z. And we didn't spend a huge, I mean, I made a big deal of pointing out why microdata are useful because they typically haven't been used exactly in this way. And I think the Earth and climate science community are hazards community are way less likely to use those data. So I just wanted to make sure everybody like becomes more familiar with them. But they're not good for everything. There are plenty of things they're not good for. So and this will be true every one of us. So I think like that's something like that we could, you know, like as a group of, you know, as a community, think about like different ways of contributing to that, because it's like it's a fitness of use sort of approach. Like, so anyhow, just put that out there.
Yeah.
This just sounds similar to something that you and I were talking about.
Yeah.
And if you remember, do you remember the NSF AI Institutes? We had that meeting in Atlanta and all the AI institutes were there, and we came out of that with a white paper. So we had a white paper that was posted on Archive that actually had a core list of authors, but then all the contributors as well. And everybody kind of contributed their ideas, their challenges, their there are things that maybe from the surveys this might come out, but I think longer detailed responses in certain formats could elicit some sort of like paper formulation, even if it's not in a journal or something, but something that's
white paper.
Right, like these spatial disaggregation, spatial aggregation came up for, I think, every group. And the choices that were made were like fit for every group and maybe can be improved, thanks for the suggestions from people. Yeah, but you know, like, I think that that's one example, like and there are many that we can, right, so.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is the right group for this, and I know that I was here Monday and then wasn't here, so maybe I'll have some discussions about this, but one thing that I feel like I am thinking a lot about in research in general as it comes to the climate space and every space, but as our computing power increases, our data increases, we have all of this large data, we're turning to supercomputers and we're turning to generative AI, which both have larger costs on the environment than our traditional computing infrastructure. And so like kind of to Deborah's point earlier about like, do we need more sampling? Do we really need more data? I do think that there's kind of missing from the literature this sort of, at what point is it worth? Yeah, how do we think about these trade-offs of like, is our work that's just gonna get published in a scientific journal actually worth that? Or when there's policy, if we, you know, like how do we kind of talk about that as a discipline and group? And I think that's really important.
I think that a little bit links to some comments that say Masha made about qualitative data. Like, could we really just get on the ground and talk to the person whose well is drying up and like maybe get some sense of exactly what this means for somebody's livelihood in a particular place, and maybe that'll be really super helpful in a more impactful way. But anyway, I agree. Like, what is it that we need, and how do we make it so?
And it's something AI can't do.
And, yeah.
Yeah.
I hope no, I don't have. Yeah.
Responses about a drug.
Yeah, thoughts, yeah, Julie.
Sorry, I don't want to
Excuse
take
me.
us off in a different tangent. Okay. This is not that well formed of an idea, but I think especially when I was thinking about this first question under teams that you posed here, John. I think we talked a little bit this past week about convergence research, and, I think I mentioned I also lead NCAR's convergence science program, and oftentimes we think about convergence as, as Mary Angelica was talking, we have a problem that we're focusing on, and you're bringing together diverse teams to tackle that. And I was thinking about how here we had that, we had these teams, some maybe more diverse than others, but it's also a team of teams, right? And maybe we're not all working deeply, we're not truly integrating in the same way that maybe traditionally convergence, we say traditionally, but convergence is often really thought about as relatively new, but what the deep integration really represents, but you're also kind of proximate to these other teams. I'm learning a little bit about that.
Space between the teams.
Yeah.
Oftentimes where those cross-pollinated ideas come from.
Right, and even
that's when we're here.
And it's kind of interesting because, it makes me think about how to acknowledge kind of how your ideas have changed when you've kind of been exposed to some of them a little bit.
Yeah.
But it just made me think at kind of a meta level, like I said, this isn't a fully formed thought, but how convergence isn't just a team of people, but it can also be kind of teams coming together. And we did have a common problem, a common set of goals, even if we're not all deeply working on specifically how we're operationalizing that problem. So just some thoughts I was thinking about, maybe something that could be a piece.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one of the things we should mention is not only were we interested in natural disaster, I mean, we picked teams that were going to be, we picked you all. Because, well, I mean, you applied, and so we had a call that, spoke to a variety, focused set of issues, but we also picked you because there was a little bit less space than there might be usually, but you all had kind of different ways of which you were looking at this from a 360 perspective. That was operating, you don't want to have people coming in from such different perspectives that they can't communicate with each other. So we had to find that happy space. I think that's what I've been most pleased about, is that there's enough difference, but it's enough similarity that there's gonna be some connective tissue that can happen this week and also could happen in the future. Somebody raise their hand. I don't know. I know. So Matt, you were gonna say something at the end of the last session, and then DJ.
Well, I'll just pick up with Deborah really quick.
Okay. DJ.
I did want to, I guess, make a couple comments on the computational aspect, or I guess the computational sustainability aspects. It's definitely something that NCAR has been thinking a lot about, and how we're going to manage that. We're already trying to do some things in our data center to, like, kind of make sure we're not as environmentally wasteful, like reusing, like basically the heat from the computers we use, like melt the snow in the parking lot and other things of that nature. One of the challenges we run into is we do use a lot of compute, but then like our proportion of total compute is also relatively tiny. Like Microsoft has a data center across the street that uses like 10x more than power than what we use, and they don't do any of the kind of environmental mitigation things we're trying to do. So it's yeah, it's one of those.
Sorry.
I think it's good for us to try to reduce our footprint. But then like how much does that affect the global compute use is sort of, it's always a hard thing to juggle on sustainability efforts. That said, I do think there is value in trying to think through strategy, not just throwing compute at everything, as much as I like to throw compute at things. And that often, like the more sustainable solutions are going to be the ones that like are well thought out. And if you're bringing too many different data sets, each data set is another point of failure and another source of uncertainty. So I think being able to still be more deliberate about this and not just Just trying to scale.
Catherine and then Beth, but first John.
I just wanted to, one thing I learned this week is that DJ is a freaking genius. So it's a great learn. That's also Catherine to have on programming. So.
Catherine and then Beth.
Yeah, so listening to this conversation, you know, another potential idea to throw out there has to do with the broader notion of ethical conduct of research. And for those of us that are conducting research in this space, what does that mean more broadly? Throw that out there and leave it there, but I'm certainly keen, and I hope that in our team we presented that that's something that we ponder. Seriously.
Yeah. So, I really just wanted to, I wasn't even raising my hand, I was just having a thought and you just. Michelle.
Comes from 35, 40 years of knowing you.
But I just wanted to say that Julie, I really like the idea about the teams of teams. And what is really great about my experience this week was, you know, all of us had more than one project going at a time. And so we came with one project, but I've talked to people about many other projects as well. And that is the kind of connection that can be so serendipitous, but difficult to trace.
Yeah, that's well.
Yeah.
Think about it.
How do you acknowledge that and trace that, right? And kind of, I mean, this is challenging, I think, anyway, when we're talking about doing any kind of team science, is how so much of it is collective, right? But I think I was just thinking it's even harder for me here to think about how do we trace this, or how do we acknowledge it, how do we show the value of just this exposure that's sort of, you know, pretty deep in some ways, but also limited in some ways, right? And also how do we continue really thinking about it quite a bit.
Thank you. Yeah, well, we have acknowledgement language that could end up in your PMCID when you produce an article. But it's true that, it is true, it's super hard, because we don't really have good mechanisms for that. Yeah.
You could have asked us to do like a little mental map, each group to do a mental map of the spaces, like the connections between the groups. Some of that was asked, but you didn't ask about the spaces between.
Yeah.
Like this, and I think that I mean, and some of it was intentional, right? Like we don't have like a ton of people here looking at heat directly, which shout out to Matt. Matt and I like to gripe about how when you study heat, when you like a lot of the population science is all around like heat, no heat. Especially when you look at.
But we had no.
I know, we had no as a wonder, I know, but sometimes heat and storms happen at the same time. So for example, right?
It was more the nature of the funding.
No, I get it. So I do, but like, and so like maybe like the spaces within would include things that were intentionally by design left out, but I think the mental map, like doing the project or thinking about what's in those spaces those spaces between is kind of a
So
fun thing.
we'll do a network, we'll do something. And
We're coming on to knowledge graphs.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard.
Yeah.
On the subject of heat, NOAA is actually running their AI workshop next week on the subject of heat resilience.
And for folks in Seattle, here is the.
Oh, great, yeah.
The what do they call it, remote, way to access it, so they'll be doing some of the workshops here, or you.
Like literally in this building.
Yeah, literally in this building, these people are kind of.
No heat studies.
No, absolutely. I feel the most understudied environmental challenge, climate challenge. Okay, anybody else? Because we have wine and dinner and, you know, anything else? Or Masha, do we have particulars that we need to share with people?
Could we get a show of hands of how many people are planning on coming to the organizing groups?
Okay,
Closing
sorry.
discussion tomorrow? Okay, it's the organizing group.
Okay.
Thank you. And then I want to say, while everybody is here then, still, I could thank Maddie and the students again, and also Masha, who has been a lifesaver.
Thank you, guys. Yeah.
So.